Oh, hello. Can you hear me? I think I'm live. I don't know if anyone's watching. If you can just confirm that you can hear me in the chat, that would be cool. Can anyone hear me? I see there's a few people watching. Cool. Okay, thank you for joining me. My name is Reed Kane, and you may know me on X as old-fashioned Marxist. My handle is Socialist Legacy, the same as this YouTube channel, if you haven't already keyed into that. And this is the first of what will, what I hope to be an ongoing series of live streams called Socialist Sunday School. So I want to say a little bit about what I'm doing here, what this is all about, and why, what I hope to achieve, and then I'll kind of dive into the kind of content that I've prepared to discuss today. So I'm just going to get my stream. Okay. So yeah, my name is Reed Kane, and I have been studying the history of socialism and Marxism in particular for quite a long time. Really about 20 years or so. Going back to when I first encountered this stuff, and I've sort of spent a long time trying to make sense of this history, this legacy, you could say. I say legacy, and I call this project the Socialist Legacy, particularly because, history obviously has all sorts of connotations, the term history. But something that I think that maybe falls out of the concept if you just think about it as history, the way we use that term nowadays anyway, is the sense in which we're talking not simply about something that happened in the past, but something that we are inheriting from the past, something that is not simply separated from us by some span of time, but the sort of remnants of previous historical moments that we carry on as sort of the dead weight of tradition of the past. And actually that dynamic of the relation to the past and how the sort of historical preconditions of our own moment is really central to Marxism in particular. So there's a sort of meta reflection on that question within Marxism. And it's a question that I've been trying to make sense of for a long time, because as interesting and provocative as I found the writings of Marx and Engels in particular early on when I was a young adult, there was always a sort of confusing. I was always confused by how they really related to the present. And when I was initially engaging with this material, I was doing it in a rather abstract way, really looking at it through the lens of philosophy. It's kind of how I was introduced to Marx as a figure within the philosophical tradition, specifically sort of coming out of Hegelianism, and I was very interested in Hegel as well, but Marx seemed like a very important development beyond Hegel that I thought was worth engaging, on his own terms for that reason, as a sort of an intellectual figure. But looking at things through that lens did not really confront me with the history of Marxism and the history of socialism more generally, in which he participated. And I didn't really know a great deal about, especially the history, well, really any of the history. Like, you get that history to some extent through the, if you will, canonical writings, which what the canon means sort of varies depending on how you come to this and when you come to this material. Coming to it through philosophy, and particularly philosophy in after the turn of the millennium, or around the turn of the millennium, coming to it at that point, the canon that I was exposed to was pretty maybe idiosyncratic if you are taking a longer view, or if you came to this material in a different way. But in any case, the history does come through in Marx's writings, but in a way that if you don't really know if you don't know what he's talking about, if you don't already have a sense of the context, he takes so much for granted that it's very easy to just not get what he's really talking about, and maybe gloss over some of those details, just honing in on the more abstract formulations that can be apparently understood regardless of what they're actually like concretely referring to, or maybe applied to the present, as if it's a kind of a one-to-one mapping from the context Marx was writing about to our contemporary context. Or worse, something that I eventually would kind of come to understand, there's a tendency to really substitute what Marx is actually referring to a lot of the time. And this isn't just true of Marx, but it is certainly true of Marx. To substitute what he's actually referring to with these sorts of ideas about what he's talking about that developed later, after Marx and Engels had passed, and really even, later than just that moment, later than like the turn of the 20th century, early 20th century Marxism, ideas that come from, say, the post 1917 development of Marxism and socialism and so on in various directions. So it wasn't exactly easy for me making sense of this history, or really making sense of Marx's ideas in their historical context, as bound up with that context, and really importantly bound up with an effort rooted in the context, rooted in the circumstances of his moment, that was aiming to transform that context, to transform those circumstances. You obviously understand that at a certain level, but the detail of it is something that is really lacking for, I think, a lot of contemporary readers of Marx, or people that are, interested in Marx. It's very daunting to overcome those obstacles. And a lot of people never really go beyond this sort of, in my experience anyway, this sort of immediate experience of not really understanding what he's talking about and just trying to apply it to the present because you don't have that frame of reference, or kind of plugging in assumptions that developed later, but that really falsify the actual substance of the argument. And in addition to that, as I was saying with regards to the sort of canonicity of Marx's writings, like there are certain writings that are certainly given preference over others, and there's also a lot of secondary literature that is given priority over Marx and Engels themselves, for better or worse, really for worse, pretty much all the time, most of the time anyway. It leads to a great deal of confusion because people are not really grasping the totality of their literary output. And there's also a kind of unfortunate proclivity to nowadays to focus in on unpublished manuscripts, which are very valuable. I'm not detracting from them. I certainly have gained a lot from reading things like the German ideology and the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844 and the Grundrisse and many other things. There's a lot of valuable unpublished material, but it's not published, it's not finished, it's not a final product. And Marx did produce an enormous amount of material that was published in his name, and a lot of it under his editorial authority, in the various newspapers, for example, that he edited, as well as, of course, his Capital Volume 1, the contribution to the critique of political economy, the poverty of philosophy, etc. And as well the volumes of Capital that were posthumously published by Engels, and I think it's perfectly justified. I'm not going to defend this point at the moment, but I think it's perfectly justified to regard Engels as much of an authority over the corpus of Marx's really of their joint writings and publications. As Marx was. So there's a lot of confusion, a lot of limitation, a lot of distortion that comes into this understanding, and that I was certainly struggling with for a long time. I should also actually mention, just it happens to be Marx's birthday today, so happy birthday to Karl Marx. My mic is a bit scruffy. What do you mean by that? Somebody commented. I want to make sure the sound quality is good. I didn't. Is the volume too low? Okay. Fuzzy. Okay. I'm not sure what I can do to fix that echo. Oh, you know what? Let me it echoes a little. How do I sound now? Did that change anything? Bear with me. I'm sorry. This is a relatively new thing. I have live streamed before, but never with the consistency to kind of master it. So I'm learning as I go, and hopefully, if there are limitations to this the quality of this stream, I'll improve them as we go forward. Okay, it's good enough. I'm gonna soldier through, and maybe for the next one, I will make sure the quality is better in terms of sound. But try to flag me in the chat if anything goes wrong. Okay, so getting back to it. So there's, so I definitely recognize that increasingly as I learned more that there was a lot of confusion about the legacy of socialism and of Marxism in particular. And I struggled with that, and that ultimately led me to the Platypus Affiliated Society, which you may have heard of, which is an educational organization that's concerned with understanding the kind of present condition of left politics in light of the history, and specifically the history of Marxism, the Marxism of Marx and Engels, and the radicals of the Second International, Rosa Luxemburg, Lenin, Trotsky, as well as the Frankfurt School. You may be familiar with Chris Catrone, who's the kind of the founder of Platypus, as well as people like Spencer Leonard and James Vaughan, who are the older generation of members. I came to Platypus around 2011, 2012, and that's really where I got most of my education in this material. I had been studying it beforehand, but was struggling to make kind of clear sense of it. That experience of participating in Platypus really helped clarify things for me a lot. But I also, Platypus is a very specific kind of orientation and objective that, as valuable as it is as a project, and I highly recommend anyone interested in left politics participated in some fashion, at least, read the Platypus Review or watch some of the panels we put on, or if you're able to participate in a reading group, definitely do that. You may not agree, but that's not really the point. The point is to learn through engaging with the existing left, including Platypus as part of it, rather than sort of, and this gets to some of the subject matter I wanted to discuss today, instead of essentially walling yourself off from the broader discussion of what is to be done, if you will, or what should be done but can't be done, perhaps, at the moment. Okay, so that's a little bit about who I am. Now, this project came out of my desire to go beyond what Platypus does in certain ways. Specifically, Platypus is very focused on a sort of negative orientation to the existing left, and its engagement with the historical left is really kind of instrumental in relation to that, which isn't to say you can't get a good education in that history through Platypus. I feel like I did, but there is a great deal that is sort of bracketed for instrumental reasons. And for that matter, Platypus is not putting out like a positive program of what should happen, what people should do, how people should organize, or anything like that. It's really not what it's about. And I can't claim to have some sort of program or whatever positive program either. But I do think, but I'm less interested in the existing left at the moment, at least in terms of the whatever organized forms it may take, particularly like there's like the academic left in universities, professors and so on, and then there's the sectarian left, the sectarian organizations and activists more generally, activism more generally, which when I was younger, there was still a lot of these older sectarian organizations hanging around from the 60s and 70s and even earlier than that. Nowadays, a lot of them have either basically disintegrated or are just so obscure that you probably have never even heard of them if they still exist. And a lot of them have basically liquidated themselves into DSA, which was one of these sects, and from the 70s and 80s, coming out of an earlier tradition that itself is seemingly disintegrating at the moment, from what I can tell as an outsider. But I'm not really interested in the academic left, and I'm not terribly interested in the sectarian left, including DSA. What I am interested in is putting ideas out there that are not being put out there at present, and not my own ideas, but ideas that are kind of intrinsic to the tradition of classical Marxism and the broader socialist tradition that it was engaging with. That, ideas and perspectives that are just sort of forgotten, or only remembered in a very distorted way. And there's a couple reasons I'm interested in doing that. So I think this confusion about the legacy of socialism it doesn't just affect people that identify with it, that identify with socialism or Marxism in some capacity. Proponents and detractors of socialism alike are sort of subject to the same confusions, the same confused assumptions and misunderstandings. They share a lot of the same premises, and a lot of the time socialists or Marxists will be essentially affirming the same assumptions that their ideological opponents cast in a negative light. So it's kind of like we both agree on what is the case, but we think it's good and you think it's bad, sort of thing, which is very unfortunate in my opinion. The failure of socialism, of the socialist movement, really the proletarian socialist movement in the early 20th century was, in my kind of estimation, not exactly an original position, but this is where I'm kind of starting from, that failure is the fundamental condition of the present world in general, like on the whole. And it really inflects almost everything about the present world, not only in like explicit political ways. And that's something that I could elaborate on, but I'm going to try to get to the point so I can move on to the main subject matter. So how and when and why did socialism fail? And what role did Marx and Marxism play within that failure? Those are sort of controverted questions. And frankly, there are some that would even deny that it failed. I think if you understand, as Marx did, the goal of socialism, of proletarian socialism, to be the overcoming of capitalism, and if you understand capitalism as Marx did, as fundamentally based upon the world market, the integration of the economic activity of all people all over the world into an integrated system of social cooperation, then overcoming capitalism very clearly, and Marx is very clear about this and not ambiguous in the slightest about this, there's no sense in which overcoming capitalism or establishing socialism, which in a way really amount to the same thing for Marx, there's really no way that can happen other than through a global transformation of the global economy. It can't happen as a sort of way of organizing people in a particular context within this global economy, like a national context or smaller or even larger. It fundamentally is a question of worldwide revolutionary transformation of society. And that clearly did not happen. At least it did not happen in the way Marx was, hoping and anticipating. It certainly did not abolish wage labor, which would be really the criterion, at least a really basic criterion for what overcoming capitalism would mean the progressive abolition of wage labor. Now, you could maybe argue that it is being progressively abolished, but it's also being reproduced in and through that abolition, through automation, which is not a new phenomenon, despite AI and all of that nonsense. It's been going on since the turn of the 19th century, and if you've read Marx, you know that, or at least if you've paid attention to what you were reading. So socialism is what capitalism would evolve into under the rule of the working class, specifically and most importantly in those countries that presently dominate the world market, those countries that are the political expression of the kind of preponderance of capital as the dominant force in the reproduction of the means of life, the reproduction of society on a global scale. So in Marx's day, that meant England above all, the despot of the world market, he called it. He said, without a revolution in England, a revolution in any other country, and then he was talking about France, which was probably among the most developed capitalist countries other than England at the time, would be a tempest in a teapot. In other words, it would be doomed to fail. And again, this is a point he makes over and over. Today, it would obviously be the United States, but also, not just England at the time. It also meant England's satellites in Europe, especially France, Germany, as well as the United States. And today, it would mean more than the United States as well. But there was no socialism today without a revolution in the United States, a working class revolution in the United States, just as it would have been impossible for socialism to emerge out of capitalism without a revolution in England in Marxist time. So whatever happened in the 20th century, whatever successes or victories you might attribute to socialism during the 20th century and even up to today, I personally would not really agree necessarily with that sort of characterization of really existing socialism and so on. But in any case, you can't really say that socialism succeeded on the whole in the way that Marx was hoping to see. So out of the effort, though, for world revolution, in that effort, the socialist movement collapsed. It went into crisis. It was unable to resolve that crisis. It collapsed in the face of that crisis. There was efforts to revive it that failed as well. Themselves collapsed and fragmented. And there was a kind of progressive disintegration of these fragments over the 20th century into smaller and smaller fragments, pieces. Although size isn't necessarily the relevant factor here. It's really the disorganization, the disintegration from a kind of integrated movement to something else. With the various remnants then kind of degenerating as time went on, growing increasingly confused and confusing to others that paid attention to them, that they educated, propagating that confusion over the course of multiple generations. So there's been many generations, now several, depending on how you count it, 2, 3, 4 generations of miseducation that has compounded over time. So the confusions have grown even more confused as the miseducated miseducate new miseducators. So it's kind of like a global game of telephone, if you will, that goes off in many different directions and whose end products are not only no longer resemble the original message, but they don't resemble each other either, except maybe in very, very partial and misleading ways. I should say also, as I'm going here, I have some stuff prepared, but if you have questions or you want to bring anything up or anything like that, please do put it in the chat, and I'll keep drawing my attention to it as I go. So Marxism was always a tendency within a broader movement, within the broader proletarian socialist movement, and that movement itself is really kind of sort of an intersection of two broader movements that go beyond that intersection. So there's a broader socialist movement, may not cohere in a single form, but there's a broad kind of family of socialist tendencies, of which the proletarian socialist movement, the working class socialist orientation, the class struggle orientation of socialism is only one, and it becomes the dominant one for a while, but even then it's not the only one. There are other socialist tendencies that are not explicitly oriented towards the working class and class struggle as the means of achieving socialism. And there's also a broader workers' movement that is not entirely socialist. There are non-socialist trade unions. There's plenty of non-socialist working class people, of course, and other organizations that are maybe in the orbit, that are maybe in the kind of penumbra of this proletarian socialist movement, that may, under certain circumstances, look to a socialist party for leadership, but may also turn against it, or at least not necessarily associate with it in a positive way. And for that matter, even within the proletarian socialist movement, there were always many tendencies, and they weren't all like really explicit. There was a period where Marxism was the dominant tendency, but that didn't mean everyone understood Marx and Marxism, let alone agreed with it. Really what the dominance of Marxism amounted to was, on the one hand, a lot of the leading figures, especially in the biggest and most influential party in the movement, namely the German Social Democratic Party, as well as the other national parties. The leaders of those parties and their affiliated organizations were themselves identified as Marxists, and a lot of them had been mentored or educated by Marx. Some of them were even like comrades of Marx and Engels during their lives, the older ones, and the younger generations, being those that were brought up in this tradition of the Marxist tendency. But there was also a broader influence of Marx beyond the fact that these influential figures like Kautsky, like Wilhelm Liebknecht, like in the U.S. Eugene Debs or Victor Berger or Morris Hillquit. Of course, in the younger generation, figures like Lenin in Russia, or older generation like Plekhanov in Russia, Rosa Luxemburg in Poland and Germany, part of that younger generation as well. Etc. These figures were influential in their writings, their lectures, their activities in the parties and in the movement. And they wrote for newspapers, or they edited newspapers that were influential, and that might have like a kind of Marxist orientation. The party programs were seen as Marxist in the sense that not so much that they were for example, the famous Erfurt program of the Social Democratic Party of Germany was seen as the party's kind of the definitive victory of Marxism as the leading tendency in the party when it was established as the party's program, replacing the Gotha program from earlier, which was represented a kind of compromise between the Marxist tendency and the remnants of the Lassallean tendency. That kind of was seen as representing a victory of Marxism, but that doesn't mean that Marxism can just be like identified with what the Erfurt program says. That program itself was a sort of a tactical victory within the movement for the Marxist tendency. But the Marxist tendency was not simply trying to get that program, and that program in and of itself is not like a definitive statement. It is itself limited and compromised in many ways from the perspective of Engels, who he wrote a famous criticism of the draft version of that program, but many of his criticisms still applied to the final program as well. So anyway, the point being here that Marxism is not about like a specific programmatic set of demands or even a particular way of thinking about the goal of a party. It's a broader conception of history and the role of the working class movement in history, and that's bound up with a conception of the dynamics of the society, the form of society that existed at the time, namely bourgeois society, the society of commerce, commodity production, and exchange. But specifically, the way that society had come into contradiction with itself with the Industrial Revolution, and in which essentially the bourgeois mode of social relations was kind of began to undermine itself through the development within it of industrial forces of production. So the forces of production corresponding to, the obvious thing to point to is large-scale machine-based production, automated production, but it's not just about the machines, it's about the way the machines the way they play a role in transforming the production process, the role of labor in the production process, from essentially isolated individual labor to cooperative labor. So the machines, on the one hand, are they facilitate the cooperation of the people that use them, and not just within a factory, but between all of the different phases in the production process, all the different moments in the production process. And for that matter, the machines also represent the sort of the elimination of labor itself as a central component in the production process. Labor in the sense that you might think of, so there's a distinction in English, which Marx remarks on in a footnote in Capital Volume 1, between work and labor, where work is essentially, purposive activity with a goal that you have to kind of put effort in to achieve that goal. Labor has more of a connotation of toil, of sort of effort that is thankless, menial, essentially. So Marx has another formulation, I think it's in the Grundrisse, that labor is essentially when human beings are reduced to doing what a thing could do. So work is goal-oriented activity, and Marx also uses the term labor in this way. Obviously, he's not writing in English, so I'm not sure about the translation differences, but he will, when he's using the term labor, he will sometimes distinguish between the way labor figures presently and how it will be transformed under socialism. And that transformation is facilitated by capitalism, because capitalism is based upon the elimination of superfluous labor, the economizing on labor. So that gets into a whole nother set of questions, and I don't want to get sidetracked here. But we could discuss that in the future. I guess the footnote was by Engels, I think someone is saying, which is probably true. But in any case, this transformation of the labor process, so on the one hand, it sort of leads to what Marx and Engels refer to as the socialization of labor, the socialization of production, production by social labor, cooperative labor, as opposed to individual labor. Whereas the relations of commodity exchange that mediate that production on the level of society emerged as the way of facilitating the exchange of the products of isolated producers that are not bound up otherwise in social relations with one another. And originally that was not individuals, or even individual workshops or something like that, but really individual societies or individual communities that were engaged in trade, but they were not producing commodities as commodities. The commodities that they produced were the result of surplus that was then free to be exchanged because it did not need to be consumed. And that leads to a whole development of the division of labor that can support commodity production, but that's a sort of that's in addition to, that's a sort of that's auxiliary to the fundamental mode of production, which was not commodity production, but direct subsistence production that was, on the one hand, direct subsistence production by the producers themselves, but also the exploitation of those producers through various different forms of compulsion. So obviously slavery and serfdom being the sort of emblematic forms, but there's actually really a kind of diverse array of different forms of compulsion under both of those regimes and others. So the reason I mention all that is because there's this really fundamental change in the nature of labor in the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution, and that changes the way these bourgeois social relations and the ideas, principles, values that correspond to them, forms of consciousness that correspond to them, it undermines those. But it doesn't undermine them in the sense of simply falsifying them, because they do still apply. People do still have to sell commodities to live. But now, instead of people selling the things they make through their own labor, the vast majority is being forced into a position where the only commodity they have to sell is themselves, their own ability to work, their own ability to produce commodities. And so, obviously you can't completely alienate that from yourself without selling yourself into just direct slavery, which generally is not legal or possible in this period, let alone desirable, although people did do that in the ancient world. But they do have to sell themselves as a commodity in order to acquire the means of life. So the bourgeois conceptions of society that correspond to commodity production do still have a real kind of meaning to the people that have to sell themselves as commodities, even if it's a kind of distorted meaning. It doesn't directly apply, but on the one hand, it seems to be a form of slavery. On the other hand, it seems to be a form of emancipation. So it's a bit complicated how it all plays out. Okay, so I'm just sort of summarizing Marxism now, and that wasn't really the intention here. But I want to just, before I have some I have some more specific material to get to, but I just want to say what my goals are with this, because, on the one hand, I'm sort of engaged in an ongoing research project that I'm attempting to synthesize a sort of broad historical narrative, if you will, of the history of socialism and the place of Marxism within it, and how our present relates to that, as well as how the whole kind of arc of history, human history, relates to that. It's a very ambitious project. It may not ever actually culminate in some singular work. It might just produce various, things. Primarily for the time being, I've written some articles that have come out of this. Mostly at the moment, I'm just really kind of posting thoughts on X, on Twitter, so you can follow me there if you're interested. But I'd like to do it in a form that also has maybe more that's more accessible. So I think audio video is more accessible just inherently. It also has liabilities as well. It's kind of a more authoritarian medium than writing, because it doesn't give you much room to think. It's you're sort of having thought shoved down your throat, if you will, but so you have to tread lightly with it, and I'm trying to. I want to help provide a kind of basic education in some ways, but I don't want to limit myself to doing like introductory stuff only. I may do that, but I want to have the freedom to develop my thoughts as they develop, and if people find that useful, then that's great, and if not, then it is what it is. And if you want me to talk about anything in particular, reach out to me, and I'd be happy to think about that and maybe do a session of this along those lines. But other than maybe certain situations where I'm fulfilling a request like that, or if I have some other motive, I'm generally going to sort of present material that is coming up in the course of my research, my reading and writing, and just see where it goes. So it may follow certain through lines, or it may jump around. We'll see. I want to recover the Marxism of Marx and Engels and their best followers, and help people, including myself, but others as well, understand how and why it failed. Both because I think it's important to understand that, just even if Marxism is just a dead tradition that doesn't have any positive implications in the present, in terms of helping motivate or guide some politics or social movement in the future. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But it's at least important for understanding why the world is the way it is, because its failure made the world the way it is. And you can't understand how and why it failed if you don't understand what it was and what the people avowing this perspective were trying to do. As I was explaining Marxism in the how it thought about the 19th century and the change of society in the 19th century, that broader historical narrative brings in political economy for very important reasons as sort of the science of bourgeois society. which Marx took seriously. He thought it was the science of bourgeois society. He thought Adam Smith, in particular, was a brilliant expositor of scientific truth, but truth that was limited to a particular form of society that, by the turn of the 19th century, so only a quarter of a century after the publication of The Wealth of Nations, had come into a crisis that was seemingly falsifying that perspective. And there were still accomplishments in political economy at that point, but in Marx's estimation, the last really great accomplishment of bourgeois political economy was that of David Ricardo, who I believe his book, The Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, was published in 1819, I think, which was the year after Marx was born, just to give you some frame of reference there. It's also right around the same time that Robert Owen is coming up with his ideas, his specifically socialist ideas in England, and Saint-Simon and Fourier in France are doing the same. Also, when Hegel is writing, at sort of the peak of his powers, I think the Philosophy of Right comes out in 1819, if I'm not mistaken, as well. So you can see the sort of conjuncture happening there. But it was through political economy, in particular, Marx's critique of political economy, so his attempt to show through the science of political economy, particularly Smith and Ricardo. So Smith kind of shows how this society works. Ricardo shows how it's coming into contradiction with itself. Although that wasn't his intention, he kind of ends up demonstrating that. And he does kind of retreat from those implications in a sort of misleading way. But, he is Marx doesn't think he's dishonest for doing that. He does think that that's a limitation of Ricardo's perspective, and that if you fully develop Smith's perspective, as Ricardo did, it demonstrates that there is a fundamental contradiction at the heart of commodity production. And that contradiction only really fully manifests with the emergence of the capitalist mode of production. So with the emergence of the industrial forces of production. 1817. So right around in the same ballpark. Marx produces this critique of political economy, which is his attempt to demonstrate that the development of the bourgeois mode of production, if you will, so the development of the bourgeois relations of production from commodity production in a more kind of primitive form to capitalist production, per se, in a general form, how that points beyond this form of society. It points to the necessity of the overcoming of this form of society. And he thinks he's demonstrated that on a scientific basis. So that theory, so the theory of history and the political economy that develops out of it, the critique of political economy that develops out of it, that is the sense in which the broader socialist movement could be really characterized as Marxist in a broader sense. So not just the political side, the political leadership, the political strategy of the Marxists in these parties, but there's a broader sense in which the socialist movement more generally embrace Marx's writings, in particular Capital, and as well as writings of Engels, as sort of giving a scientific basis to their movement. But that doesn't mean they all understand the movement in the same way, or that they necessarily agree with the Marxist sort of orientation fully, or even understand it. A lot of this perspective of Marx and Engels was really developed not in broad public writing, but in correspondence with party leaders, with occasional materials like circular letters and pamphlets and things that maybe wouldn't have a wider audience, maybe newspaper articles that weren't necessarily getting a wider exposure. So there's and personal conversations and so on. So it's not so much like Marx and Engels ever published this is the Marxist political strategy, this is what you need to do. And they didn't really think about it that way either. but they did nonetheless have a pretty clear sense of what needed to happen in a general way and what could contribute to that or impede it. Okay, so let's see, I have some comments here. Yes, Marx praises Ricardo. Yeah, Marx is... So Marx will say maybe apparently snide things about like a Smith or Ricardo or a Hegel or people like this from time to time. And that's the sort of thing I was talking about that can get taken out of context. Because generally he's always giving a great deal of esteem to those sorts of figures, as well as like Robert Owen and Fourier and even Saint-Simon, although Marx is a little colder towards Saint-Simon than Engels is, for reasons we could talk about in the future. What Marx has a lot of contempt for are that's kind of an older generation than Marx, or even several generations older than Marx. What Marx has a lot of contempt for are his contemporaries. So the contemporary Hegelians, the contemporary political economists, the contemporary socialists, because he thinks that they are at a far lower level generally than the great figures. So like Proudhon is a great deal, he's certainly, he proves to be a great deal less kind of incisive and brilliant than a Saint-Simon or a Fourier. And even Feuerbach is a dwarf compared to Hegel. And so on. And even the Ricardian socialists, these proletarian-oriented, working class-oriented people that are kind of engaging in a critique of political economy before Marx while they've made some significant contributions, they aren't Ricardo or Smith, for that matter. Okay. So most of what passes for socialism today is, in my estimation, a fundamental obstacle to the kind of politics that Marx and Engels saw as necessary. So maybe their politics does not have any political cachet in the present or in the future. But if it does, the socialism and the Marxism that people espouse today, generally speaking, is definitely an obstacle to it having that positive role to play. Being laden with confusion, contemporary socialists are very attached to images, to aesthetics, specifically, and phrases drawn from really more the 20th century and really the post-1917 period than what I would consider to be the classical Marxist tradition and the kind of 19th century socialism from which it emerged as a critical current. And to the extent that they do kind of draw upon this earlier tradition, it's through the lens of this later period, which is a very distorting image, a very distorting lens. So it's a very, in my opinion, the attachment to socialism and Marxism, even where it seems more serious than just like shit posting on Twitter or whatever, like say DSA, it's still extremely superficial, and really does not get it doesn't seem to have like a really substantial grasp on what it's drawing upon historically. So whatever is necessary politically in the future, that obstacle, born of confusion and miseducation about history, about the history central to the contemporary world, needs to be cleared away. I think it's a major obstacle to thinking through the present in any case, even if Marxism is completely irrelevant for going forward as a positive politics. But I don't think it is irrelevant, but even if it is, I think there's utility to what I'm trying to do here, namely clarify this history. So teaching about that history should help at least with that, but if it does still carry some positive potential in the present, if Marxism does still carry some, or socialism more generally, does still carry some positive potential in the present, drawing people away from that the confused and degenerate forms of socialism, regressive forms of socialism and Marxism, toward that potential, and towards the history from which that potential sort of emanates, I think is valuable. So, again, Platypus is more concerned with that, with drawing people away from the bad, the dead left, the dead leftism, kind of exposing the dead leftism for what it is, and kind of getting people to either take the previous history more seriously or just realize that they aren't actually interested in Marxism, that they are really just Democrats that want to dress up their attachment to the Democratic Party and its politics in a more radical garb, which is totally unnecessary, and totally, all it does is confuse people, including them. So there's no need to do that. If you want to be a Democrat, be a Democrat. You don't need Marxism for that at all. Okay. So one thing that I'm particularly interested in, besides going into the history of Marxism in more depth, which I plan to do in these streams, is the revival of Debsian socialism, what I would call the Debsian socialist tradition. So the tradition of Eugene Debs, who was a leading figure in the Socialist Party of America in the first few decades of the 20th century. He was 5-time presidential candidate for the Socialist Party of America. And I'll talk more about this in the future, but I just wanted to flag it. Because I think Debs in particular, as well as many other writers and orators and public figures in the Socialist Party of America, were really brilliant at translating the Marxist perspective into an American idiom, whereas most of what we have is really filtered through the European context, which is very different in a lot of significant ways, including the forms in which the discontent of working people are articulated. In Europe, there is obviously a significant sort of admixture between the kind of new forms of bourgeois society and bourgeois political, the bourgeois political forms that correspond to it, with remnants of feudalism that are not fully purged really until the 20th century. Even in a country like England, they're still hanging on in various ways. And to the extent that they were fully purged in the 20th century, I would say they were really just the aesthetics of them changed, but the substance remained the same. So it's still reactionary. It's just now it's not aristocratic reaction or clerical reaction so much as like petty bourgeois bureaucratic reaction. And that's what we have in the United States as well, even though we never went through that kind of aristocratic period. Feudal aristocratic. The Socialist Party of America was not perfect, obviously, and I'm not trying to hold it up as a positive example so much in terms of its practical orientation, although I think there is a lot to learn from that. But I do think that to the extent that it was able to coherently articulate the Marxist perspective in an American context, it has a lot of value today, because I think it translates to, so to speak, ordinary people a lot more fluently, certainly in the United States, and I think maybe in Europe as well. It translates a lot more fluently than the sorts of discontent that evoked, say, pre-bourgeois forms of communal property in a nostalgic way, which it comes out of a reactionary tendency, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. You can use it to your advantage, but you have to be careful not to get trapped in your own rhetorical, the rhetoric. You can't get trapped in the images, the phrases that you may be raising, not spontaneously, but because they correspond to the forms of discontent among the working class. You can't get trapped in that, but you do have to be able to articulate this perspective, this Marxist perspective, in and through the forms of consciousness that working people already have. And that's what they did in Germany and France and elsewhere in Europe in the 19th century. It took a different form in the United States because the United States was very different. It didn't have those feudal admixtures and vestiges. It developed on a purely bourgeois basis. I actually posted something about this earlier today on Twitter, but I'll leave the point there. I think it does have a lot of value, if only rhetorically, to consider the way those appeals were made at the time. And they were very successful, all things considered, even if the political kind of project that they were in service of ultimately was not able to overcome its own internal contradictions. But the same was true of the movement in Europe, including in Russia, for that matter. So. Steve Roberts says the political idiom in the UK compared to that in the USA can be partly attributed to the depth and range of the UK Bonapartist state into society. That's a question. That's a really complicated question, Steve. I think that would be a really good subject for another stream. It would take us very far afield for me to address that properly today, but maybe if you could flag that and remind me, that would be a great thing to discuss in the future. Okay, I want to get into the main body of material here, but just a few more quick things. The propaganda. So part of my research, besides really kind of delving into the writings of Marx and Engels and their historical context, and sort of trying to create a narrative of their own role, their lives and their life's work within the socialist movement, that is more true to reality, I think, but also speaks more directly to the present than any others. I think there are some decent accounts in biographical, so to speak, accounts, maybe not intellectual biography, but there are some decent biographical accounts of Marx and Engels, but they're decent at best. Even like Franz Mehring's book, or like Liebknecht's Reflections, or Bebel's Reflections on Marx and Engels, even the biographies of Engels that Engels produces of themselves, of him and Marx, like various kind of biographical reflections. Those are probably the most valuable, but those are all very limited to certain periods of their lives, or very brief, or oriented towards specific moments. So they have their limitations as well, and they always obviously leave a lot out. I think it's worthwhile going into the depths of this stuff. But in addition to that, and in connection with the point I made about the Debsian tradition, there's an immense body of material, propaganda material from the old socialist movement. I'm only fluent in English. I have a passing understanding of German as a reader and French as a reader, but I'm not fluent, certainly. So I'm sort of isolated to the Anglophone material, but there's an immense body of material out there that is really worth studying. Not so much for its theoretical merits, because I don't think anything was more theoretically valuable than Marx and Engels' work, but to the extent that it, on the one hand, can help shed light on that work, both what it emerged from and in response to, as a criticism of, but also the ways in which it influenced and had an impact on the kind of more popular material, the newspapers, the pamphlets, the slogans, the imagery, the music even, maybe to a lesser extent. There's a huge amount of socialist music, socialist songbooks, and I've been trying to record some of that, and I'll put some of that in streams in the future, and sort of draw up some of this propaganda material to kind of help show how you can talk about this stuff without appealing to people essentially through the idioms of the new left, which is what basically all leftism is today. It's derivative of one or another current of the new left of the 60s, 70s, and which is itself premised upon the old left of the 30s and 40s, which is really, in my opinion, that's already too late to really understand the essence of this tradition. And if you look at the older material, the older tradition, through the lens of those periods, you're going to be lost, in my opinion, at least with respect to how to talk about this stuff with people that aren't already partaking in this idiom. Because the new left idiom is very, very deeply compromised, to put it very lightly. And even though it's sort of been integrated into mainstream ways of thinking and talking about politics in significant ways, it is poisonous, in my opinion, because it has been, for no other reason, it's been totally assimilated to the political the sort of political rhetoric and forms of political appeals made by the Democratic Party in the United States and their analogs in other countries. So, the problems go deeper than that. But at the very least, if you talk about things the way the New Left understood them, not only are you going to be, in my opinion, most likely confused about what you're actually referring to historically, but you're also going to be essentially telling people that you're a Democrat. And again, if you want to be a Democrat, that's fine. But you should not, Marxism is not for you. It's just not. You should worry about what you actually care about. And if you care about Marxism, then you need to understand that the Democratic Party is the enemy. The enemy. They're not in any way an ally. They are the enemy. People will sometimes say, well, they have the trade unions. But guess what? They have the trade unions, to the extent that the trade unions aren't wholly beyond redemption. I don't think they are, at least not in terms of the rank and file. But to the extent that they aren't beyond redemption, some of them may be, but to the extent that they're not, they're captive to the enemy. They're instruments being used by the enemy against the working class, against the prospects of proletarian emancipation. Maybe not consciously anymore, but it certainly was conscious when it started, at least on the part of some. So in any case, the consciousness doesn't matter so much. What matters is that you're not going to change things, whether by appealing to like identity politics or by appealing to like workerism or unionism, in the sense of like seeing the trade union wing of the Democratic Party, like the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party or something, as like the left wing, like our wing that we should join in. No, the Democratic Party is not really a political party at all. And I know Jacobin and DSA will make this argument, in the sense that like, well, that means that we can use it. Like we can run in primaries because it's not a real political party. No, the sense in which it's not a real political party is the sense in which it's just an instrument of the state. And Seth Ackerman even makes this point. Seth Ackerman wrote a relatively famous article back in 2016 that was published in the Jacobin issue that came out on the same day as the election of Donald Trump, interestingly enough, called Blueprint for a New Party, I think it's called, where he's basically making an argument for socialists and Marxists and people interested in that sort of thing, using the DSA as, he doesn't make it at this point that explicitly, but it's pretty clear this is the essence of his argument, use the DSA as a means of essentially building up socialism through running DSA candidates in Democratic primaries. And and I don't know if he makes this argument in that article. I think it might have actually been in an interview around the same time. He basically says that, I think it is part of the argument in any case, that these parties, the Democratic and Republican parties in the United States, are not really parties. They're really part of the electoral infrastructure. And that what we really have is essentially a party state that's not dissimilar to like the totalitarian party state in other countries that are very blatantly authoritarian and so on. And I think it's absolutely bizarre that you could think that that is an argument for using, so to speak, the Democratic Party, ballot line, or trying to do so, to build up socialism. All you're going to do by running socialist candidates as Democrats is further tell the broad population that socialism just means what the Democrats want, and in particular, what the kookiest, most kind of off-kilter and absurd of the Democrats want. Which is not the message that I think we should be trying to send to working people across the United States or across the world. So anyway, this is something that we could go into more in the future. So I do have broader plans for this project beyond just the live streams, which I'll talk more about maybe in the next episode of this, which I will likely be doing I think I'll be doing it 3 weeks from today. I have I'm going to be busy the next couple weekends, but whatever 3 weeks from today is, the 26th, I think. So I will plan to do to maybe discuss that a little bit more then. Okay, so I recently gave a series of lectures for the School of Materialist Research, which is a kind of a graduate, interdisciplinary kind of graduate program, which are available on YouTube, and I think I linked them in the description of this stream. On the subject Marx and Engels and the Dialectic of Theory and Practice, which if you're interested in what I've been talking about, I recommend watching those. It was actually a series of 5 lectures. The second lecture, I wasn't very happy with how it turned out, so I would recommend watching the lectures 1, 3, 4, and 5. You can watch the second one as well if you'd like, but I think it didn't really. I wasn't able to kind of do what I wanted to do with it, and I ended up kind of compensating for that shortcoming in the other ones. But in the process of that, I left out a lot of material I wanted to cover. And in particular, there was a sort of the tail end of the last lecture I had to truncate. And what I was talking about in the last lecture was the role of the party for Marx and Engels, and the relationship of the party to sectarianism on the one hand, and opportunism on the other. And I only really covered sectarianism, and I didn't really get to opportunism as much. So I want to talk about. I want to finish fleshing out that conversation, or that discussion a little bit, but it really actually kind of opens the door to a huge amount of things to discuss, some of which I did cover in those lectures, but a lot of which I didn't. So I'm going to try to sketch out some of this here for the remainder of this stream. And I will come back to this subject and engage with it in a much more thoroughgoing way going forward with this. With these streams, which I hope to do at least one a month, or hopefully 2 a month if I can manage. So I will get back to this material soon and maybe begin from the beginning, whereas here I'm sort of beginning in media res, and if you haven't seen those lectures, this may be a little disjointed, but hopefully it'll suffice for this first sort of trial run at these streams. So you probably, if you're familiar with this stuff at all, you've probably heard the term sectarianism and opportunism before. And of course, they have a broader usage in society as well. They occur a lot more commonly in circles that talk about Marxism and socialism. But so I'm going to try to give as best I can a broad summary of how Marx and Engels understand what those terms refer to, and sort of how their politics relate to them. So, and in particular, focusing on opportunism. So, sectarianism and opportunism are really two kind of fundamental tendencies that affect the proletarian class struggle in the course of its development. They impede or undermine that development, but they're also inevitable. They're kind of natural results of the development of that movement. And development in that sense could mean both forward movement and backward movement, like there's like progress and regress in the course of development, and sometimes it's more complicated. Actually, it's almost always more complicated than a straight line forward. It's usually involves sort of spiral movements and recapitulations and returning to old problems and new contexts and so on. So it's not simply that they occur in the course of progress, but they do, and they also occur in the course of less auspicious developments as well. But nonetheless, they're natural consequences of the development of this class struggle, one way or another, and hence that that struggle, the proletariat, in the course of that struggle, must be it is inevitably going to confront them, and so it should be prepared to confront those tendencies, and it will have to confront them and overcome them in order to advance to its ultimate culmination in, the classless society. So they, and for that matter, these tendencies, they reflect fundamental tendencies of the broader society in which this class struggle is occurring. They're not simply relative to the proletarian movement itself. They're sort of fundamental tendencies of bourgeois society, and specifically bourgeois society in its self-contradictory development in capitalism. There are tendencies in which the struggle unfolds, and which therefore are manifest within that struggle itself. I'm reading notes that might be a little fragmentary at times, so I apologize if that's the case. Okay, so these tendencies, for that matter, don't simply confront the class struggle from without either. So they're not simply confronting the proletarian class struggle through like the adulteration of alien influences, like alien class elements or whatever, like petty bourgeois elements or bourgeois elements or peasant, whatever elements. But that does happen, but they are also continuously reproduced within the proletarian class movement itself through its victories as well as its defeats. So I want to make a point when it comes to thinking about this, and this is also really a more general point about the Marxist sort of approach to theory really in general, and I discuss this in much more detail in those lectures, that it's perilous to try to understand these things with in an undialectical way. So in a way that is, as it were, flat, that sort of flattens out the opposition in a one-sided manner into sort of like an abstract opposition, where, for example, like you might say like X is good and Y is bad, for example, or to just see like sectarianism and opportunism as like directly opposed to each other, when really they're really both expressions of the same dynamic that emerge together in one way or another, maybe not simultaneously, but if not simultaneously within a given tendency or organization, or between different, say, splits of an organization, or different organizations or different tendencies coming into conflict with each other. It can also take the form of like a zigzagging of a single organization over time, for example. These things can figure in a lot of ways. But they're not simply opposed. There's a fundamental interpenetration of opposites, if you will, as Engels puts it. So I want to actually now, something that is characteristic of, as Engels describes it, sort of metaphysical thinking or anti-dialectical thinking, would be a tendency to not only flatten out these sorts of oppositions in an abstract way, but also to line up the categorization of phenomena in terms of lining up various different conceptual oppositions as if they simply relate to each other in a straightforward way. Can be useful to do this. And for that matter, like, so to speak, metaphysical thinking or anti-dialectical thinking, what Hegel would call the understanding, the use of the understanding, so kind of like categorization, and so on. It's not like that's bad and you shouldn't do it. It's an element of the thought process, and it's an inevitable element. The problem is when you fixate upon it instead of understanding it for what it is, namely a provisional moment in a process that you need to go beyond in order to fully cash out its its content, its truth content. So understanding things is only a first step towards reasoning about them, if you will. And dialectic is to the dialectical approach is to the metaphysical approach in Engels's idiom, as reason is to the understanding. So making so in a sense, relating judgments about the world to each other is why you're making judgments about the world, applying concepts to the world. You're doing it in order to reason about the world, and not just reason for yourself, but in relation to others, in discourse with others, and in practical relations with others that are mediated by reason, or in which reason at least plays some role. Okay, so, but some of they can be useful, but they can be treacherous to sort of line things up this way. So, for example, some tempting ways of lining these things up would be to see sectarianism, the tendency towards sectarianism, as like a left-wing deviation, as like an ultra-left deviation. There was a tendency to associate sectarianism with anarchism in the Second International in particular, or ultra-leftism, another way of thinking about it, and opportunism, for that matter, as like a right-wing deviation. And there's truth to that, but it's more complicated than that as well. So don't fall into the trap of just identifying these concepts with each other. There is a sense in which there is very, first of all, for one thing, as I was mentioning a moment ago, sectarianism and opportunism are bound up with each other in such a way that the tendency towards sectarianism automatically generates the corresponding opposed tendency, both without and within. So, in a sense, veering too far to the left it's not like the horseshoe theory. It's not like if you go far enough to the left, you end up on the right or something like that. It's more like if you go too far to the left, you have to ultimately swing back to the right in order to survive, and vice versa. And this is something that, to really explain what I mean by that, it requires a more detail, and I don't know if I'll get into enough detail to satisfactorily explain that here, but I'll try to at least lay some foundations. Another related association, it would be like revolutionary versus reformist. Sectarianism is this kind of revolutionary, like ultra-revolutionary, revolutionist tendency versus like the reformist, the reformism of opportunists, or the opportunism of reformism. Theory versus practice. So sectarianism as like a kind of preoccupation with theoretical abstractions at the expense of concrete reality practice, whereas opportunism is just the opposite. It's like a fixation on practical necessity, pragmatism, quite literally like opportunism in that sense of taking advantage of opportunities in practice at the expense of principle, at the expense of theoretical principle. Again, there's some truth to that, but you can't go too far with that without distorting things. Party versus movement, or goal versus movement. Catastrophism, which would be like the sense that changes happen through dramatic kind of short-term, dramatic, widespread transformations, as opposed to kind of a gradualism or an evolutionism. Social action versus political action is actually an interesting one, because it's much easier to see in this case how that opposition straddles the other opposition, the opposition between sectarianism and opportunism. It straddles it in a complicated way. And I'll just illustrate that very briefly here by pointing out that, so there are two big historical reference points for opportunism versus sectarianism in the proletarian socialist movement that are related to Marx in a very important way. There's one that emerges before Marx and that he's responding to when he enters the socialist movement. And there's one that sort of emerges through Marx's influence and through the Communist League. And that ends up kind of getting out of, so that becomes a sort of, I'll explain what I'm talking about. So the one that occurs before Marx enters would be generally captured by the opposition between Blanqui and Proudhon. So Louis Auguste Blanqui being like the emblem of like sectarianism, this sort of sectarian orientation, versus Proudhon as an opportunist. Now, to really flesh that point out, I'd have to talk a lot more about the history, which it's not, again, it's never really that straightforward, but this is a general, a sort of, this is this is just for illustrative purposes. It's really more complicated than that, but there is a sense in which before Marx is on the scene, the kind of pinnacle of sectarianism could be seen as the Blanquist conspiratorial sects that are trying to instigate revolution through the old methods of the secret society and the provocation of insurrection on the part of the masses to undermine the existing government. Whereas Proudhon is, and Proudhon's kind of anarchism or mutualism is not, first of all, Proudhon is explicitly not revolutionary. He thinks the time of revolutions is over, and he's more interested in social transformation through social action. He's not opposed to political action, but he doesn't think it's his place to be like in charge of it. So, for example, when Louis Bonaparte becomes president of the Second Republic during the French Revolution in 1848, Proudhon welcomes Bonaparte as potentially being a means of bringing about the sorts of changes he thinks are necessary, but that doesn't mean he was aspiring for political power himself. So the other opposition that comes about after Marx, and in large part through his influence, or his maybe a distorted result of his influence, would be that between Bakunin and Lassalle. So, but here things have sort of reversed. So whereas in the previous case, Blanqui is in a sense engaged in a form of political action through revolutionary insurrectionism, trying to initiate political change that way as a means to social change. Proudhon doing the opposite, so Proudhon not seeking political change, but rather seeking social change instead. Bakunin is sort of an insurrectionary in the Blanquist mold, but he's also a disciple of Proudhon and his anarchism, although he sort of transforms it, in part through Marx's influence on him. But so Bakunin is anti-political action, and he views insurrection as, just casting off the state, just destroying the state to free society from political domination in order to allow it to develop through social action. Whereas Lassalle, so Bakunin is a sectarian in that sense, but he's an anti-political sectarian. Whereas Lassalle is political. He's oriented towards electoral politics, in particular, trying to win suffrage for the working class in the German Empire, as well as trying to influence Bismarck in a similar fashion to how Proudhon hoped Louis Bonaparte would pick up his program. Lassalle hoped to get Bismarck to take up his program. So Lassalle is both he's a political, he has a political orientation in an opportunist way. So just to give you a sense, like again, this can all be elaborated in a great deal more complexity, but just to illustrate the point, it's more complicated than social versus political lining up directly with sectarian versus opportunist. It actually both sides can go in both directions, and they do. Another one would be voluntarism versus determinism. I'm not going to say much about that now because that gets into a whole other can of worms. I was just mentioning, like, on the political side, there's like insurrectionism versus electoralism. On the social side, there is like there's trade union action, which involves a direct confrontation between the working class and the capitalist class, an immediate form of class struggle or a primitive form of class struggle. So it's not really a class struggle, but it's a struggle between members of the different classes, versus cooperativism, which is, to the extent that it has its own independent theoretical elaboration, it has a more petty bourgeois sort of conciliatory attitude towards the conflict between the classes. It's trying to provide an alternative to the class conflict involved in wage labor. It's not really fair to like oppose cooperatives to unions in that way. And really, if either side is doing that, it speaks to their own sort of sectarianism, because really they're interrelated phenomena that function best when they cooperate with each other as opposed to being opposed to each other on some ostensible theoretical grounds. And that's fundamental to Marx's orientation, that all the various forms of working class association should be drawn together into a common struggle that is ultimately oriented through the political struggle, but that cannot be exclusively oriented through political action without losing the real substance, the content of the struggle. Okay, so I want to say a little bit more about the theory and practice element. So sectarianism you can draw a distinction. Actually, Hal Draper, who's very influential on me in my perspective, draws this distinction between sectarianism as sort of a theoretical tendency and the sect form of organization as a sort of practical tendency. And they don't necessarily coincide. They can, but they don't necessarily coincide. You can have people that have a sort of sectarian perspective, even if they don't have their own independent organization around them. And there are sect organizations that try to have a theoretical perspective that is non-sectarian. And that's very common. DSA is a great example of that, but that's true of a lot of the various Marxist sects that that issued out of the New Left. Sort of, if you've ever heard like multi-tendency organization, what they're really talking about, they're trying, when people talk about multi-tendency, they're trying to point back towards the earlier moment of like the Second International, the parties of the Second International, which did have multiple tendencies in them, as I was saying earlier. But what the people today, or over the last few decades, have actually been doing when they advocate for like multi-tendency organization is building sects that are theoretically incoherent. So they don't even have the virtue, if you will, of a sect, or at least the potential virtue of a sect in preserving a certain body of theoretical perspectives in a relatively coherent way. Now, generally speaking, sects can't survive very long without distorting their own theoretical perspective, because they're inevitably driven through internal and external pressures to move in an opportunist direction, so to compromise on their own theoretical perspectives in order to survive, in order to get members, in order to get dues-paying members, in order to get subscribers to their publications, in order to engage with the broader masses in one way or another. In order to stay afloat, unless they have some independent source of financing, which they generally do not, certainly not when things are at as low of a level as they are today. So, nobody with money is taking any of this seriously, even if they are like an Engels, someone who is, attached theoretically to the standpoint of the proletariat, despite their actual class position. So there's a distinction there between the kind of theoretical side of sectarianism and the practical organizational side. And for that matter, I think an important thing on that point to flag is that sect is often used as a sort of, in my experience, a sort of term denoting a small organization in terms of its size. And that's misleading. Sects are not necessarily small. They can be very large. What sect actually refers to is not size, but what it really is a reference to is religion. A sect is a religious organization. And Marx actually spells this out explicitly in a letter to, I think, to Schweitzer, who is the person who took over Lassalle's organization after Lassalle died. Or it might have been another letter from around that time in the 1860s, 1870s. But he spells out very clearly, when I am talking about sectarianism, I'm talking about a religious orientation. And that connects Marx's long-standing critical perspective on sectarianism with his earlier kind of education, his development in the context of the young Hegelian critique of religion. And that's a big subject that I will cover in more detail in the future. That was actually a really fundamental part of the lecture series I mentioned earlier, as it was at least originally conceived. But I think I left a good amount of that out just because I had to narrow down what I was discussing. So Steve Roberts says that, I think referring to what I was just discussing, this is great but challenging. Black and white is relatively easy, lazy to understand. Guilty as charged. Reed is here demanding we understand all of the many shades of gray in between. Yes, and to be fair, the way I'm putting it here is not going to really help you understand. What I'm trying to do here is point out that it's easy to oversimplify, and there's obvious reasons to want to do that. And it can be useful as like a heuristic device to oversimplify things, as long as you know that that's what you're doing. It can also be useful for like agitational purposes in a different connection. But as long as you're aware that that's what you're doing, if you fall prey to your own formulas, if you fall prey to your own slogans or to your own, sort of, models, your own toy models of things, then you're going to lose the substance of what you're actually trying to think about and talk about. And frankly, for that matter, in my experience, most of the education that people have in the history of socialism and Marxism today, and going back for many decades, has been on the basis of like these sorts of heuristics, oversimplifications, examples, slogans, rhetoric, images, not the substance, not the conceptual theoretical substance, or for that matter, the real substantive historical material that underlies all of that. Okay. So sects are defined by their ID fix. It's a French expression. I'm probably not pronouncing that very well. They're essentially their fixed idea, the idea they fixate upon. Their nostrum or panacea, so their kind of cure-all solution to the social question, which they embrace with a kind of religious devotion or faith. So not a sort of rational, critical, not in a rational, critical way, but they sort of embrace it in a sort of way that's insulated from critical challenge, from rational challenge. They close themselves off to the broader movement by their doctrinaire insistence on their given theoretical or for that matter, kind of programmatic, practical proposals or what have you. And that can even be something as milquetoast as the DSA nostrum, which I would characterize in terms of, on the one hand, the orientation towards the Democratic Party, building up socialism in and through the Democratic Party's primaries, the way the DSA today, or at least going back to 2016, understood that is different from the Michael Harrington perspective out of which DSA was born. They're related, but they're different. Harrington actually was more realistic. He didn't think he was building up socialism so much as building up the preconditions in which a socialist movement could eventually arise, which would be a kind of genuine liberalism. So today, the DSA obviously doesn't think of itself in those terms. That's more realistic, even if I think it's strategically, I think it was strategically misguided on Harrington's part. Not that I can prove that, but that's my suspicion. Today, I think what they're trying to do is a lot more delusional. It's not as grounded in reality as Harrington was. And for on that point, Harrington was at quite a remove from reality as compared to the earlier tradition as well. But for understandable reasons, I think, given what had happened in the course of his life. Nothing really significant has happened in the course of my lifetime, in my opinion. Potentially significant things have happened, but that potential was squandered every time. Okay. So sects nonetheless have an important function for Marx in the early phases, the very earliest of phases of the development of the class struggle, and when the class movement, the proletarian class movement, is still in its most rudimentary and primitive stages, as means of helping to educate the proletariat, the proletarians, to help. And a lot of the time, what sectarian organizations actually do. There is the kind of conspiratorial, insurrectionary side of like the Blanqui sort of sect, but that doesn't exhaust sectarianism. There's also a much more. So there's on the other side. So there's like the revolutionary insurrectionism on the one side, and then there's like the utopian separatism or utopian sort of optimistic rationalism on the other side, which would be like the Owenites or the Saint-Simonians, things like that. Owen, for example, did think that there needed to be a sort of millennial, and I mean that not in the sense of millennials, but an almost sort of an almost kind of like eschatological transformation, like a worldwide transformation of society that could very well be described as revolutionary in a sense, but he didn't think that political revolution, let alone a political revolution led by a working class party engaged in a class struggle, was a means of achieving that revolutionary transformation. So there is this sort of religious millennialism or millenarianism that is in a way in common to like a Blanqui and like a Robert Owen or a Saint-Simon, even though they have very different practical orientations. But a lot of the sectarian groups, maybe with the exception of some of the most doggedly insurrectionary, were very concerned with educational activity. So, for example, the League of the Just, which was a Blanquist group and famously is reorganized into the Communist League when Marx and Engels join, their main motive activity in the late 1830s and early 1840s, after they became sort of disillusioned with the sort of secret society insurrectionary model, was educational activity and building public, open educational associations for the working class. So like the German Workers' Educational Society, which had chapters in all over the place, but the most famous chapter being in London, where Marx was a participant for at least a time, giving lectures and so on there. That sort of activity, that sort of educational activity, was very central to a lot of these groups, and the Owenites in particular in England played a very important role in the early phases of the development of the proletarian class struggle through that sort of educational activity. Ultimately, the working class movement would take it up itself. So like the Chartists, the trade unionists, the cooperative movement built their own educational organizations and associations and sort of separated from the Owenites. And they sort of went their separate ways in a way, although there was still always a relationship there. Okay, but for this education to advance beyond this elementary phase, it must strive to test these ideas, not only against one another in theoretical arguments, like as theoretical abstractions, so not just arguing whose ideas are correct, but testing them in practice, in the practical development of the class struggle. And, the Owenites and various other utopian sects did try to test their ideas in certain ways with, like, for example, the cooperative movement itself was born of that, although it was more born out of Owen's kind of proletarian followers or working class followers. But there was also, of course, famously, like the utopian communities that various different sects had built, mostly in the United States. Actually, there were some in France and England, but mostly in the United States, because there was plenty of land to do it there. And what they were trying to do with those it wasn't so much an experiment in the sense to see if this can work. It was more an example of what they were advocating that it would need to be scaled up. Like, they didn't think, at least the Owenites certainly didn't think that they could simply build these communities and they would simply maybe gradually take over or something like that. But he did think that they could help show men of power and influence that these ideas were good and worth taking up on a bigger scale. So they were sort of working models. Okay, and so I'm going to come to opportunism, but I want to mention that. So I want to explain what movement means, and maybe this is pedantic, hopefully not, but I think this term gets thrown around a lot without reflection on what we're actually talking about. Movement, and certainly in the context of Marx's work, is like a social movement, for example, is people in motion, quite literally, but not simply in like physical motion. Motion had a broader connotation at the time of change in general, so it could be motion in space, but it could be motion from one state to another, one condition from one condition to another, including a place, but also various in other senses as well. So people in motion, people that are caught up in a process of change, so they're bound up in change that's befalling them. But so movement isn't simply being moved. It's not simply having change happen to you. It's when you respond to that change. It's when people respond to that sort of change by trying to orient that process of change toward an end or goal. So instead of allowing it to simply happen, like instead of being sort of blown around by the winds of historical change, trying to take that momentum and direct it towards something that would be desirable. Okay. This can bring them, and in the case of the proletarian class movement did bring them into conflict with the existing forms of society. So you could think of it like these changes are already happening in society, and they're blowing the working people around. They're blowing them out of self-employment into proletarianization, for example, or they're blowing them out of employment into unemployment, or they're blowing their sources of income away, or whatever. These forces don't just affect people, they also affect the forms of social life, the forms of relations between people that constitute the social order. And that happens through the effects on people, of course. But say if the working class is in the course of this change that they're confronting in the Industrial Revolution, trying to do something about it, they themselves become an expression of that force of change, a conscious expression, a partially at least conscious expression of that force of change that is itself then brought to bear on the social forms that are preventing them from realizing the goal they set for that process of change that they're trying to realize through that change. So, the obvious example here would be, they're trying to overcome proletarianization by, or at least initially they're trying to mitigate the adverse consequences of the Industrial Revolution, initially by destroying the machines, Luddism, but ultimately by coming into conflict with the employers and as well, and in broader forms than that as well. But the employment relation ultimately, not just the employers as people. So these, so that's movement. Party, I think, needs to also be clarified in this context because party now has a very distinct connotation, which would be more, I think, to be more precise, there's a sense of party in the 19th century and in Marx's usage in particular that is related to but different from party organization. And party organization can take various forms, but typically party organizations are related to party in this broader sense. So party in the broader sense could be thought of as like a current or tendency within a movement, as I was just describing. So a particular goal or a particular conception of a broader goal that is moving within this movement, but that doesn't necessarily follow the exact same course as everyone involved in that movement and may end up diverging or leading in a different direction than other currents. And those tendencies, those currents, those parties, so those currents or those tendencies are oriented around a locus of ideas, of perspectives of what should happen, of what is happening, what can happen as a result, and what should happen as a result. And a party is essentially like it's the people grouped within a tendency grouped around a particular locus. So there's like the Marx Party. There's like the parties in general in the early 19th century, especially when people use that term, that's really what they're referring to. And the locus of ideas is usually like a newspaper or a publishing enterprise that publishes a newspaper as well as maybe like a theoretical magazine and pamphlets and books if they can. Sometimes it's multiple newspapers. And sometimes it's just intellectuals that publish in different venues that move between them. And in that sense, like these publishing enterprises are like the center of a party or the center around which a party is organized. The party being like the people involved in this tendency or people involved in the movement that are moving in the same direction as this tendency that ultimately end up orienting their movement, their participation in the broader movement on the basis of the ideas that explicitly articulate the goal or potential goals toward which the tendency is orienting. So you could think of like current or tendency as a little bit broader and a little bit less explicit, a little bit more unconscious. But currents or tendencies can kind of become concretized, can become solidified into a party through an intellectual expression that articulates what the current is implicitly moving towards, clarifying what it is unconsciously moving towards, what goal it's unconsciously trying to realize. And so party, in that sense, is like a kind of fleshing out, a kind of rendering more substantial and more solid of a tendency within a movement. And of course, you can pull back at scale and say, like, a movement itself could be a tendency with an even broader movement. So there's a sense in which the proletarian movement, at least in certain periods and in certain contexts, is itself a current within the bourgeois revolutionary movement, for example. So anyway, pulling back from that point, party organization, so like kind of the elementary party organization would be this kind of locus of ideas, which could be an actual organization in the sense of like a publishing enterprise or a newspaper, which is why, Marx's political practice is entirely based, at least in the first half of his life, around editing newspapers. And later on, he doesn't do that anymore because he's more concerned with his books. But he nonetheless still understands the significance of newspapers. And if you pay attention to the political developments of Marx and Engels later on, while they are kind of very happy to be done with that, it's not because they don't think it's important. It's because they think they have a much more important role to play than editing newspapers or engaging in kind of like agitation and propaganda, which consume a lot of time and a lot of energy and distract, in their opinion, from really important theoretical work that needs to be done. But there's other things that need to be done as well, and they knew that, and so they did contribute to these, newspapers. They did advise the editors or try to advise the editors. So like Liebknecht, LaSalle, Schweitzer, these were newspaper editors. That's what they did. That's what the party was in its core. Steve, these questions about Bonapartism are great, but it's just, I can't deal with Bonapartism. I want to wrap this up relatively soon, and it opens so many questions. So I'll read the question here, but I'll try to come back to it in another stream. But Steve asks or says, does not the vast scope of the Bonapartist state in most advanced society, advanced in scare quotes, preclude or limit massively the possibility of testing theory in practice today? Yes. Short answer, yes. But again, I'll make that a subject of another stream because it's just such a big question. And I haven't even really gotten to the subject matter I wanted to cover here. So let me get to it. Okay. And then I was saying about party organization. Now, depending on the movement, what the party is depends on what the movement is trying to accomplish. So the party organization ultimately needs to take, especially when it's a political party, when it's oriented towards political change, needs to take on broader forms of organization than a newspaper, because there's broader forms of organized activity that are necessary beyond publishing a newspaper. So, for example, the most obvious one would be like electoral activity needs an organized form just to facilitate it. It doesn't need to start that way, but it needs to ultimately have an organized form in order to facilitate running candidates and so on. But that's not but electoral activity was not the extent of political party activity in Marx and Engels' time. And in fact, the two of the most important examples of political party for Marx, Chartism in England and the Lassallean organization in the early 1860s in Germany, neither one of them could run candidates, at least not working class candidates, in the sense that they didn't operate in exactly the same way, because what they were really trying to do was get the ability to run candidates, at least in terms of working class candidates. So they might be like a middle class defender of the Chartist movement, but what they really want is the ability to actually stand candidates from their rank, from the rank and file, and ultimately that's essentially what Lassalle's organization was pushing towards, in substance at least. That's a complicated story, but so for example, agitation for suffrage is not necessarily, doesn't take the form of like running candidates, but it may take the form of rallies and petitions and these sorts of things. You need organized forms to deal with that. And there's other forms of party organization as well, usually auxiliary forms, like the women's auxiliary, because obviously women had a second class status, so they had a whole different set of needs and concerns that were not directly bound up with the struggle for or with standing candidates. per se, not that they couldn't participate in that, but like that's why they would have like women's auxiliary organizations and so on. And even trade unions, some of these parties would build trade unions because they didn't have trade unions. And they may not be integrated into the party machinery, but they are, in a sense, part of the party in that looser sense. Okay, so let me move on. So Marx and Engels didn't, as far as I can tell at least, didn't seem to have the term opportunism or opportunist in their vocabulary. I don't know if there's maybe a translation discrepancy here, but I haven't found it in use in their writings, those terms themselves, although they are certainly in use by the turn of the century in the Second International. They're in use in the context of the revisionist dispute. But nonetheless, the concept is definitely operative in Marx and Engels, and there's a few different terms they may use to get at this, but the main term they used was Philistinism. So whenever you see Marx and Engels talking about Philistinism, they're talking about opportunism. That is a very short way. Not always necessarily opportunism within the working class movement, but so Philistinism was also kind of a synonym for petty bourgeois. And so basically the idea would be that the opportunistic tendency in society more generally is embodied in the sort of aspirational stance of the petty bourgeois to ascend in through bourgeois social relations, so to essentially overcome the sort of destruction that class is constantly undergoing under capitalism, to essentially become bourgeois, to become properly bourgeois, to overcome being self-employed and to become like an employer of other people, to have a passive income, if you will. But not on the basis of land, or at least traditional land ownership, rather on the basis of modern bourgeois social relations and production. So Philistinism also has certain connotations, a major one being anti-intellectual. That's certainly like the main connotation it has in English usage today, but it also had that sense when Marx and Engels used it. So anti-intellectual, so like Cretan, being uncultured, being small-minded. So I wanted to actually tell the story of how this term enters the German vocabulary, because it's kind of interesting and instructive. I hope you'll pardon, this is a little bit of an indulgent digression. But I promise I'm going to develop this discussion in far greater detail in the future. So if this is leaving something to be desired, this is not the end of the discussion by any means. So let's see. So the origin of the term Philistinism in the modern usage, meaning essentially petty bourgeois, anti-intellectual, crude, uncultured, petty, vulgar, materialistic, in the sense of like concerned with material wealth rather than like higher spiritual things, spiritual concerns, self-concern as opposed to concern with higher things like moral principles and hence like concern for others out of principle rather than instrumental, egoistic motives, that sort of thing. The modern use of the term stems from a conflict in the 17th century, in Germany in the 17th century, between university students and townspeople in the town of Jena, Germany, which would later be famous, among other reasons, because at the university in Jena, around the turn of the 19th century, its teaching staff included Fichte, Hegel, Schelling, Schlegel, Schiller, so like some of the greatest luminaries of German idealism and romanticism. I think the patron of Goethe was, I don't know if he was the head of the faculty or he had some role there that played a role in that. So it was, at least at that time, very important in that way for at least a while. But going back to the origin of the term, so in the University of Jena was founded I think in the 16th century, as an intellectual home for Protestantism. And this is during the Protestant Reformation, which is a massive period of conflict and upheaval. It's really the first wave of the bourgeois revolution, if you will. And so this university in Jena was like a headquarters of Protestant radicalism, really. And the students were known at this university for their radicalism, and in particular for their championing of Freiheit, freedom. In 1689, a propitious year, certainly, if you know your history, in the town of Jena, a fight broke out between students at the university and townspeople, which was something that happened all the time. But the fight broke out in 1869 that ended in a student being killed and left for dead in I think in the town square or somewhere in public. The following Sunday, the superintendent of the university, a guy named Georg Heinrich Gotze, delivered an impassioned sermon denouncing the townspeople. And in the course of the sermon, he analogized the townspeople to the Philistines, or Philistines, in the biblical story of Samson. And using this phrase from that account, the biblical account, the Philistines be upon thee, Samson. So kind of, he's basically, on the one hand, warning the students, and on the other hand, sort of browbeating the townspeople. The term may have already been in use at that point. It's not clear, but after that, it became came into very prominent usage among the students at Jena as a term of derision for the uneducated, sort of prejudiced, unenlightened town dwellers, the petty bourgeois, if you will. And from there, it spread to the entire German university system, and it became common currency amongst the educated elements in German society throughout the 18th century and into the 19th, and that's how Marx and Engels picked up its usage. It was in usage among the young Hegelians, for example. If you don't know the story of Samson, I hope you don't mind me continuing this indulgent tangent, but it's an interesting story. I don't know how educated a lot of people interested in socialism are about the Bible and Christianity and Judaism and all that. It's worth knowing this stuff, really it is, for many reasons, and not just because Marx and Engels make a lot of reference to this stuff. It's worthwhile. But anyway, let me just give you a very quick and dirty version of the story. So Samson, the account of Samson, you probably have an idea of what Samson is about. I think it's in popular culture to some extent. The guy, his hair gets cut and he loses his strength. But let me tell you the whole story, at least in outline. So the story of Samson is part of the book of Judges in the Old Testament, in the Tanakh. And the book of Judges is about the tribes of Israel having settled in the Promised Land after the Exodus, after the conquest of the Canaanites in the book of Joshua. The tribes of Israel were settling down in Canaan, in the Promised Land, and they did not yet have like a unified kingdom. They were, living a much less organized existence at the time. But instead of kind of a unified political leadership in the form of a king, they were led during periods of crises, conflict, and so on, by temporary military leaders who were called judges, hence the book of Judges. And Samson was the last of the judges in the book of Judges. So the stories in Judges follow a formula, and there's several of them. They all basically follow the same formula. And this is actually a broader pattern in the Hebrew scriptures as well. And it goes something like this. So the Israelites disobey the laws of Yahweh. So Yahweh sends foreign tribes to punish them. The Israelites then pray to Yahweh for deliverance. They repent and ask for his protection. And so he appoints a leader from among them who, with divine assistance, leads them in defeating the enemy and restoring peace. And then the Israelites start disobeying the laws again, and then it happens again. So when Samson is chosen as a judge, the Israelites were embroiled in a conflict with the Philistines, and that's the tribes in a region called Philistia, which is actually where the term Palestine comes from, interestingly enough, although this isn't like the same ethnic group that is today called the Palestinians. It's just, that's where the Romans got the term Palestine from Latinization of Philistia. So Samson's mother was told when she was pregnant by the angel of the Lord, who is, Christians think that this is the way Jesus actually shows up in the Old Testament as this character called the angel of the Lord. That's not how that's not how Jews see that character. But anyway, so the angel of the Lord appears and says that her child will deliver the Israelites from the Philistines, who they're involved in a conflict with. But to do so, she had to be consecrated to God, or he had to be consecrated to God through the vows of the Nazarite, which basically means like you take a vow that sets you aside from the rest of society to show that you're kind of promised to God. And part of that vow is that you don't cut your hair. And so Samson grows up, and when he grows up, he falls in love with a Philistine woman, and he seeks to marry her, which is against the wishes of his tribe, his parents. But he does it anyway. So he ends up going to the Philistine homeland and trying to wed this woman. The subsequent events, and so actually you could read the story as like the subsequent events being Samson's punishment for going astray, not marrying in his own tribe. But there's also part of the biblical narrative is that Yahweh is actually using Samson in order to lead the Israelites to victory against the Philistines. So in a sense, if Samson's like kind of a sinner who's ends up being punished for his sin, it's actually the Lord, it's actually God who leads him to sin in order to accomplish a task. It's so, if you have a Christian upbringing or a quasi-Christian upbringing, that might sound a little unusual, but yeah, actually that's a lot of the Bible has that sort of character, especially the Old Testament. So Samson, in his desire to go beyond his tribe, is like the unconscious tool of history, as it were, in an earlier epoch, following his in a way selfish desire as opposed to the tribal demand placed upon him. He actually ends up doing something that is in service of his tribe. So it's an interesting kind of proto-bourgeois. I'm kind of reading that into it, but that's certainly the way it may have been read in the bourgeois epoch. Okay, so the Philistines hold a wedding feast for Samson, but he becomes embroiled in a conflict with them. I'm not going to go into the details. And he ends up leaving and going back home. And the Philistines marry off his bride to someone else. And he finds out about this and he's not happy, but they promise to give him another bride. But he's so upset that he ends up burning down their olive groves. And so then they murder his bride, the woman that they were going to give him to marry. So then he kills a bunch of them, and then they send an army to compel the tribe of Judah, Samson's tribe, to hand him over. And so he says to his tribe, he says, it's okay, give them to me, it's fine. So they hand him over, and then when he's in the captivity, the Philistines have him in bondage, he breaks through his fetters with his superhuman strength and slaughters 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of an ass. Just an interesting, colorful detail, kind of typical, kind of horrific, gory, ancient narrative. Samson then falls in love with another woman named Delilah, who the Philistines bribe to betray him. They basically say to her, we want you to discover the secret of his strength and reveal it to us so that we can, defeat him. Delilah gets Samson to tell her that God gives him his strength because of his Nazirite vow, and that if he ever cut his hair, he would break the vow. Delilah then cuts his hair while he's sleeping, and the Philistines are able to capture him because he's lost his strength. They then gouge his eyes out, which is, maybe symbolic punishment for his wandering eye, if you will, and enslave him. So then sometime later, he is, as a slave, he's in a Philistine temple during a sacrifice to one of their gods. And at this point, his hair has started to grow back. And he prays to Yahweh to restore his strength. And he does. He gets his strength back, and he uses his strength to grab onto the pillars in the temple and pull them down, which causes the entire temple to collapse, killing him and everyone else inside. So that begins the war between the Israelites and the Philistines that then goes into Samuel, the next book, where you famously have David versus Goliath, and then ultimately David becomes the king of the united Israelite kingdom and defeats the Philistines, and et cetera, et cetera. So I hope you don't mind that digression. I think that's first of all, it's an interesting story. I think it does actually bear on, at least as a sort of metaphorical example in certain ways on what I've been discussing, but I'm not going to elaborate on that in detail because I'm going to try to wrap up relatively soon. Okay, getting back to the actual subject matter. So one side, so I want to talk a little bit more about the relation between these dynamics, these tendencies towards sectarianism and opportunism and the class movement of the proletariat. So on the one side of the class movement of the proletariat, the class movement of the proletariat distinguishes itself through the distinctive interests, class interests of the proletariat as a class. So it's not the interests of proletarian individuals in the sense of like they all automatically just have common interests by default. They do have common interests by default, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are consciously articulated as common interests. And that also doesn't mean that they necessarily outrank every interest in the sense that, they may not necessarily be pursuing these interests, but they are interests that they can be led toward as implicit in their economic position, even if they aren't necessarily consciously grasped as interests for one reason or another by particular individuals. And these interests only really emerge through the development of the class struggle beyond its most elemental forms, which would basically be the discontent of individual people reduced to a proletarian condition with that condition. So in the condition of the working class in England, for example, Engels says that the first phase of this movement is crime. And he doesn't say that in a positive way. He says that's not a good thing. That's where things start out when the movement is still just mired. Basically when there isn't really a distinction between the lumpen proletariat and the industrial proletariat. The lumpen proletariat basically being just people without property in general in the ancient world up to the medieval and early modern world. Obviously, what lumpen proletariat means begins to take on a different character in the course of the proletarian class struggle, but that's a subject for another time, I think. It then develops from there to Luddism. So it's concerted effort on the parts of groups of proletarians that recognize a common interest among them, but it's in a very alienated form. It's in a very obscure and confused form where they see the machine as the enemy and they attack the machine. Or it may not be that unsophisticated, but it's reactionary, certainly, in the sense that it's trying to prevent the the forward development of capitalism, which for Engels is, already at this point, early in his intellectual development as a socialist, already recognizes is the means of their emancipation. And that had already been worked out in the development of the class struggle up to that point, up to 1845, or 1843 when he first kind of encounters it. So it develops beyond Luddism, which is still reactionary. But so the interests of the proletariat as a class, though, don't fully emerge as the class struggle develops in these kind of early phases. So you get like the early forms of combination, what will become trade unionism, of turnouts, what would become strikes. You will get early experiments with cooperatives and other forms of mutual, what we might now call mutual aid organizations, or what was called at the time like beneficial societies, friendly societies, fraternal societies, various things of this nature. Usually, essentially what these organizations or associations, maybe is a better word, were, fundamentally what they were was a fund that the people involved paid into, and that had some sort of elected leadership to manage the fund for common ends. And that could be like a strike fund, that could be an insurance fund for unemployment or disability, injury, disability. Retirement maybe was not really on the table at this point, but eventually retirement funds, and of course, that could go beyond that. It could take the form of using the fund to fund a cooperative enterprise or a consumer cooperative, or to fund educational activity, or to fund trade union activity, and so on. And a trade union has such a fund at its core, regardless of in addition, or kind of as foundational. Obviously, trade unions collect dues from members, and those go into a common fund. So what a workers' association was, in an elemental sense, was a fund of the earnings of its participants, that was managed in common through some kind of elected leadership organized around some common goal or set of common goals. And it's out of the development of those forms of association, whether they be combative in the sense of like trade union activity, usually defensive, early on, trying to prevent wages from falling, or trying to prevent people from being fired, and so on. So there's these kind of cooperatives, or maybe less combative, maybe more aspirational. But ultimately, you get the emergence of Chartism as the political expression of this sort of association of workers around their common interests, that points towards the possibility, and ultimately the necessity for Marx, this is Marx's perspective, of the association of the entire working class on the basis of the interests it has as a class. So not in the sense that this group of people has a common interest, but in the sense that anyone in this position has this interest, at least implicitly, if not explicitly understood. And so the point of like a political organization is not simply the political struggle in and of itself, and for that matter, all of the more primitive or more particular forms of organization. Their real kind of implicit content for Marx is that they are oriented in the direction of the development of articulating the common class position to which all of them belong, and the corresponding common interest to which they all belong. So what is that class position? What it is the fact that capitalism, this is this is an important point that I'm going to try not to get sidetracked, but I want to make it in case it's not clear to anyone watching this, that so if you've read Capital Volume 1, or at least if you've been educated on the basis of Capital Volume 1, read parts of it, have heard summaries of it, whatever, Capital Volume 1 is brilliant, and Marx does, to some extent, encapsulate the broader dynamics of the capitalist mode of production within it. But Volume 1 is not in and of itself an account of the capitalist mode of production, or at least it's only an account of the capitalist mode of production in a general form, not in terms of its actual concrete, its concrete kind of full development. It's what it really is a picture of of capitalist production per se, but the capitalist mode of production is not simply capitalist production of commodities, which is what Capital Volume 1 is concerned with, fundamentally explaining the dynamics of that process. It's about the generalization of the capitalist production of commodities, which is actually coincides with the generalization of commodity production itself, which is a whole other story. Trying not to get sidetracked. But you really only get the full, you don't even actually get it here, but you only really get the full explanation of what the capitalist mode of production itself is with Volume 3. So Volume 2 and Volume 3, Volume 2 building up to Volume 3. Because what capitalist production is not simply commodity production. First of all, it's not commodity production. It's the production of surplus value, and really what it is the production or the reproduction of capital, with surplus value being a means of reproducing capital and commodity production being a means of producing surplus value. So that's really important. At least that's what it is for the capitalists. Now, Marx's critique of political economy had a broader, there was a broader plan that he was, at least initially, I think he never abandoned this. Some people think he did. A broader plan that went beyond the books on capital. So there would be the books on capital, and then there would be a book on, or maybe several books on landed property, and then wage labor, which would be like the first trilogy. And then there would be an additional trilogy that would go beyond that, which would deal with the state, international trade, and then the world market and crises was to be the final part. And it's only in that last part that you would get really the full explanation. But nonetheless, there is it is at least contained in outline, certainly in Volume 3, and to some extent in Volume 1 as well, although it's much more limited. Volume 1 can be very deceptive because people think that what Marx is saying is that capitalist production, specifically capitalist production of commodities, is bad or something like that. And we shouldn't have that, which is not the point at all. In fact, it couldn't really be farther from what Marx is getting at. But capitalist production of commodities, so producing a commodity in order to expropriate surplus value from wage laborers that are involved in that production, is only one piece of a much bigger puzzle. The generalization of commodity production itself is a profound historical shift in history that is motivated by capital accumulation, but is not simply a consequence of capital accumulation in an abstract sense. There is capital accumulation in the ancient world, merchant capital, money capital, and merchant capital. But it's not really capital in the modern sense because it doesn't take over production itself. It just is sort of a parasite on a production process that is not fundamentally about producing even commodities, let alone producing surplus value. Surplus labor is expropriated from the direct producers, but in different ways. It's not through commodity production, through surplus value. It's expropriated through direct exploitation, through compulsory labor, whether that be in the form of slavery, where the owner or the master of the slave just simply appropriates the entire product of labor and then essentially gives the slave means of subsistence out of that, or serfdom and various other forms of bonded agricultural labor. Anyway, I don't want to get sidetracked. I am getting sidetracked. Okay, so the point of Capital Volume 3 and building up to a Capital Volume 2 as well is that you need to look at capitalist production not as the production by a particular capitalist firm or particular capitalist for that matter. It's not about this firm producing profit, producing surplus value, reproducing itself. And Marx does get at this towards the end of Capital Volume 1 in the chapter on the historical tendency of capitalist production. This is what he's alluding to in the future volumes, is that you really need to look at the entire process of commodity production and exchange, so production and circulation as a whole, because the production of commodities on an industrial scale presupposes that commodity production is already universalized, both in the sense that the immense majority of people are already or are coming to depend upon selling something to acquire money to purchase means of subsistence as opposed to direct subsistence production. But also in the sense that there is a mass of people on the market that have nothing to sell but their labor power. So it presupposes both of those things. And not only presupposes them, but it reproduces, it posits those presuppositions, as Marx puts in a Hegelian turn of phrase. So it reproduces its own preconditions, but in a different way than they emerged historically. Okay, so in order to have capitalist production, industry, industrial production, as opposed to artisanal handicraft commodity production, which is secondary to other forms of exploitation. In order to have that, you have to have a fully developed commercial society. And that only emerges with as Engels puts in a lecture to the German Workers' Educational Association I mentioned earlier in 1847, only comes about because of Christopher Columbus and essentially the opening of the world market. So Vasco da Gama, but he in a famous lecture, he basically says, Christopher Columbus is the reason that all of this is happening, which is both a bad thing, maybe, from an immediate sense, but ultimately it points towards the possibility of a far more profound form of emancipation of human beings than has ever been possible in history. Okay. So, which ultimately comes out of the capitalist mode of production. So what how Marx thinks of it in Capital Volume 3 and the way he builds up this argument through political economy is you really need to think about capital not as the capital of a particular firm producing commodities, or even maybe not producing commodities, but involved in the circulation of commodities, or even money capital. You need to think about the unity of production and circulation as a whole, which is the third volume, what the third volume subtitle is. And really what you need to think about is the total social capital, the total capital of society, as a single capital that is reproducing itself through all of the various forms it takes, all of the various, kind of all the different relations that manifest within capitalist firms, but also in commerce on the world market, even in non-capitalist forms, even when you're trading something that wasn't produced in a capitalist manner, like wage labor, for example, labor power. So you really need to think about capital as an integrated whole, like a machine that encompasses the entire world. And that machine, like the infrastructure of that machine, is the world market. And everything else is built upon the relations of cooperation facilitated through the emergence of the world market, and on the world market, not simply through free trade, which, ultimately is not, it creates too many problems to simply have free trade. What you need is a credit system, an international credit system, financial system, to mediate between these capitalist firms and the state and society more generally. Okay, so the reason I say all that is because it's really important to understand that the capitalist mode of production presupposes the proletariat not as isolated individuals. In fact, it has to turn them from isolated individuals who can only depend on themselves, on selling a commodity as an individual. It has to turn them from that into a united workforce, an industrial army, an industrial reserve army, but of course the reservists, only some of the reservists are actually in the reserve at any given time, whereas a significant number of them are always called up to battle in industry, in the factory, and they may be sent back into the reserves at any given time. But so the industrial reserve army is not just the unemployed, really. It's the reservists are the unemployed, but at any given moment, a lot of that army is actually on active duty in the factories or in the various, in the offices, in the shops, in whatever. capitalist production is not on the basis of individual wage laborers. It's on the basis of an army that encompasses all workers in every field, in every industry, in every country, all over the world, organized into a single machine and cooperating with each other through that machinery of both actual machines, but also the social relations that are kind of structured in an almost like integrated machine-like system. Okay, so who's producing? What capital really is the collective laborer, which is what I just described. It's this industrial army of the proletariat. So what is capital? Ultimately, what capital is the proletariat. But because nothing happens without the proletariat, like none of this stuff works without the proletariat. But the proletariat as a whole, not particular proletarians as individuals, in particular industries, in particular workplaces, in particular countries, it depends on the entire thing, including the unemployed being unemployed. The entire thing is part of the system. And none of it works if the workers are not cooperating. None of it happens, nothing moves. Even the machines that are automated need people to service them, to manage them, to build them, to, etc. So, what capital really is the mode in which this society of universal cooperative labor is organizing itself in a self-contradictory way, where the individual members of this industrial army, despite the fact that the entire world, including they themselves, depend on their universal cooperation, it's self-contradictory because they nonetheless still relate to themselves, to one another, to the social production process in general, as if they're individual commodity producers that have to sell a commodity as individuals. Whereas what they really are is part of a universal system of social production based on universal cooperation that is actually directly producing for subsistence at the level of the whole, producing for use at the level of the whole, but the use is not the use of the individual workers, it's the use value of the system as a whole. And what is the use value of the system as a whole? Surplus value, reproduction of the entire system through accumulation of surplus value. So what socialism really means for Marx is, in a sense, capital, which is this almost demonic, unconscious force that is sucking the blood out of society, waking up to what it actually is, which is the collective working class of the world, understanding what it is and consciously directing its collective activity, its cooperation, instead of being dominated by the inherited forms of that activity as if they're a force of nature over which they have no control. The capitalists, as Marx says over and over again, are just they're just character masks of this system. They're essentially functionaries that the working class creates a role for because it is not consciously organizing its own universal system of cooperation. Okay, so that is the whole point of Marxist politics, of the working class. It's not about injustice, it's not about exploitation, it's not about any of this stuff. What it's about is about waking up capital to what it is, namely the working class that is in the process of abolishing its own conditions as essentially subject to compulsory labor, to self-enslavement. Okay. Now, I'm going to wrap up now, because I know this has gone on a while. If you've stuck with me all this time, thank you. I appreciate it. So, when we talk about petty bourgeois, that can mean a lot of things, and I'm going to elaborate on that in much more detail in a future installment of this, but for now I just want to flag something, which is that to the extent that the working class, members of the working class, individual proletarians, relate to themselves and to each other in the mode of their concern with their own individual place in society, that inevitably has a kind of petty bourgeois character. And it's not like a bad thing. Okay, what does petty bourgeois mean? It means aspiring to rise up in and through bourgeois social relations. And that can take an antagonistic form, and frankly, generally or at least often, a reactionary form of wanting to tear down the big capitalists, the big bourgeoisie. So that may be like tearing them down so that others can rise in their place. It may mean like a universal leveling so that it's like universal small scale production or something like that. It may be like completely incoherent. I mean, even those things are incoherent. But they make a kind of intuitive sense if you're not thinking about things at the level of the whole, the way I just described. If you're trapped within that standpoint of being an individual commodity dealer, namely a seller of your own labor power, of course, unless you're like versed in Marxism or you're bound up in an escalating movement that's coming into conflict with the existing forms of society and having to develop beyond the limitations that give rise to those conflicts, that's trying to reshape this kind of structure of this system of social relations in which they're bound up. If you're not part of that, of course, your relationship to your place in society is at least potentially aspirational, like looking to advance, to rise up, maybe rising up within the proletariat itself. So to the upper layers of the proletariat, the better paid layers of the proletariat, the labor aristocracy, if you will, which is not like, I'm not using that term in like a register of like the labor aristocracy is corrupt or whatever. It's more complicated than that. There's liabilities to them, but there's also liabilities to the flip side, which are the people that are at the very bottom of the proletariat and are either, the so-called Lazarus layers of the Industrial Reserve Army that are like chronically unemployed and succumbing to various forms of degeneracy as a result. I mean, not to stigmatize them, but, being in a kind of in a chronic condition of dependency, desperation, having no horizons for advancement in society, being isolated from the basic forms of social relations of society, has a corrupting influence on people, and it doesn't automatically turn you into like a criminal or something, but it certainly puts you in a position where you're susceptible to that sort of thing and falling into the lumpen proletariat, which for Marx are propertyless people that are dependent on essentially parasitic activity, the paradigms being criminal activity and beggary. But there's other forms it can take. And for that matter, Marx actually characterizes the financial aristocracy, so the layer of the bourgeoisie, the money capitalists that live purely on interest from investments, rentiers that just collect dividends. He actually describes them as the lumpen proletariat reproduced at the highest level of society. So anyway, so they're criminals that run society, or at least they're at the highest echelons of society and have a dominant influence. Under highly developed capitalism as well as under early capitalism. Okay, so I feel like I might have I hope I didn't like lose the thread of this point about opportunism. I'm trying to bring it back home now. So opportunism reflects this kind of petty bourgeois inclination to, in a sense, advance in one's interests, to the extent that it's rooted in the proletarian class movement, it gives expression to this more general kind of petty bourgeois aspirational orientation, which can again take kind of a kind of volatile and violent reactionary form. Fascism being like, for example, like an especially virulent form of that. But it can also take a kind of more, a kind of a progressive revolutionary form, at least in certain contexts. The problem with the petty bourgeoisie per se, and also the various middle stratum that are the kind of elements that are kind of in that realm of straddling the class division between bourgeois and proletarian, is that they are one of the problems with these elements is that they are very subject to forces beyond their control. So whereas the proletariat is really grounded in the fact that every day you have to go to work and you're answering to your officer in this army, and that discipline and the education that you have to have in order to be be an enlisted man in that army, let alone an officer of some rank, is, those are the weapons, or those are among the weapons that the bourgeoisie itself arms the proletariat with. So there's those weapons, the weapons of industrial discipline, which basically shapes the proletarians into a force unto themselves, at least potentially, and they need consciousness of their common class interests, but they have the potential to act collectively on the basis of the fact that they have to do so every day as part of in order to earn a living. So there's those weapons. There's also like the intellectual weapons and political weapons that the proletariat obtains from the bourgeoisie by virtue of supporting the bourgeoisie in its own revolutionary opposition and ultimately overthrow of the vestiges of feudalism. And while, as I did say earlier, of course, those vestiges are at least ostensibly swept away in, certainly they were never present in the United States, at least not in a significant way. And I'm not counting chattel slavery in that. That's more complicated. But also in Europe, for the most part, and a lot of the rest of the world, they nonetheless, those feudal vestiges have come back. And so I mentioned Steve Roberts was asking about Bonapartism. This is going to have to be a whole nother discussion. But Bonapartism is the modern form of reaction. So it's not simply that the bourgeoisie has not yet replaced the remnants of feudalism as the political force, the ruling force, not only in society, but over the state, over political power, with their representatives as governing the state. It's that there's a kind of new form of reactionary state that emerges in and through the rule of the bourgeoisie in society, in a context in which it's unable to fully consolidate political power as a class because of the class struggle. And so that takes various forms, and sometimes it involves remnants of feudal admixture, but in a different way. So Bismarck's regime in Germany being an example of that. But a different example would be like Louis Bonaparte in the Second Empire. And a further different example would be the forms it takes in England and also in the United States. And as Engels puts it in, I think in his introduction to the Civil War in France, he gives this great description of how this same tendency is manifesting in the United States through the two-party system, the Republican and Democratic parties, at least as they were constituted in 1890, or I think it was 1890, around that period. Obviously, he and Marx had a different estimation of the Republican Party in an earlier period, but ultimately it becomes part of the same mechanism as the Democratic Party, if you will, which is this tendency to turn the state into a bureaucratic apparatus of political management of the class struggle that nullifies, or at least maintains, the class struggle within manageable bounds. And that means infringing on the rights of the proletarians as well as the capitalists. Certainly the smaller capitalists, certainly the petty bourgeoisie, but even the big capitalists can be subject to this. But the flip side of that is, of course, that at the end of the day, while the state has a certain degree of autonomy as the bureaucracy, and it has almost a kind of a class interest unto itself, or a quasi-class interest unto itself, which is really kind of lumpen proletarian in character, or for that matter, financial aristocracy like. It's also kind of more complicated than that, in that this is a subject for another video. I'm gonna leave that aside. Okay, so the reactionary state does come back under capitalism, under the fully consolidated rule of the bourgeoisie. We don't live under a world where, as Marx and Engels thought, when the bourgeoisie is in power, that will allow the proletariat to develop its independent class movement and ultimately organize itself into a political party and contest for power and win power. The form of the dictatorship of capital changes with the revolution of the failure of the revolutions of 1848 into a form that can prevent that from happening. And there's nonetheless still pushback against that dynamic of this bureaucratic degeneration of, for example, the bureaucratic degeneration of the Republic in the United States, or of the French Republic into the Second Empire, or of what have you. There's different examples of it. So there's this bureaucratic degeneration that is itself in the crosshairs of a sort of revival of bourgeois revolutionary political concern. So civil liberties, for example, would be demanding civil liberties be actually respected, whether or not, or that they actually be protected as they are supposed to be in the United States, is a bourgeois revolutionary claim against this reactionary bureaucratic state that is undermining the Republican form of government. And that's bourgeois. But for Marx and Engels, and we'll talk about this again in the future, to avoid or to recoil from, or to, for that matter, oppose these sorts of bourgeois political forms of opposition to the state is sectarian. It's sectarian in the sense that you're isolating yourselves from the progressive movement of history in the direction of the class struggle. So that isn't simply a movement within the proletarian class movement. There's also a broader movement of society in that direction, which is towards the full expression of the rule of capital over society. And for Marx and Engels, the logical endpoint of that is the democratic republic. That's not an endpoint the bourgeoisie and their parties, or for that matter, the petty bourgeoisie, is able to ultimately bring about of its own volition, with the possible exception of the United States, for example. But for the most part, they can't be relied on to go that far, because ultimately they retreat from the full consequences of their own political aspirations out of fear of the proletarian movement, out of fear that the proletarians will take advantage of those developments to ultimately overthrow them or whatever. I mean, it's not like they don't want there to be socialism as Marx envisioned it. They wouldn't have even understood what Marx was talking about, and they still don't. What they oppose is what they would consider to be like an anarchic crisis brought about by the rule of people that are just not fit for rule, because that's just the way they look at working people, rightly or wrongly. But that same sectarianism that isolates itself from that broader, not the class movement of the proletariat, but the broader class movement of, if you will, the third estate or the bourgeois revolution against the reactionary state, which is itself a kind of a class struggle, or at least an echo of an incomplete past class struggle. Marx and Engels thought that the accomplishing of the goals of the bourgeois revolution was a necessary condition for the full development of the proletarian class struggle. That's not to say it can't begin to develop beforehand, but it cannot fully come into its own without achieving that. And so that doesn't mean that the proletarian movement can or should subordinate itself to the bourgeois or petty bourgeois parties. Absolutely not. Marx and Engels never thought that, or at least not from like 1845 onwards. Certainly not in England or even France. And even in Germany in 1848, when they go back to Germany during the German Revolution, the first thing they do when they get to Germany is they try to organize workers' associations, as well as setting up their newspaper, the Neue Rheinische Zeitung. that's what the Communist League members who go back to Germany start doing. They try to build these workers' organizations, but with the exception of they have a little bit of success, but ultimately it's not paying off because there just isn't enough of a proletarianized working class to to understand the need for these independent working class organizations. To the extent that they're politically moving, they're moving in the Democratic Party, in the petty bourgeois Democratic Party, which is itself the kind of radical left wing. So the workers, to the extent there are proletarians, in the German Revolution, they're like the radical left wing of the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party itself is like the radical left wing of the bourgeois Republican Party, which is maybe not fully developed as a party because it is kind of enmeshed in this broader bourgeois liberal party that is fundamentally seeking a constitutional monarchy. And republicanism, maybe there are some radical bourgeois that are advocating republicanism, but something that was crucial to the development of Marx and Engels themselves was this recognition that the German bourgeoisie never really attained the radicalism and the enlightenment of the French and English bourgeoisie, and trying to understand why that was the case, why they essentially remained Philistine, why even the largest capitalists in Germany had a petty bourgeois perspective, and it's because they were unable to fully develop. And so this gets into more things I'll cover another time. But so the point I'm trying to make here is that the Marx and Engels did not think that the working class should subordinate themselves to the petty bourgeois Democrats, but they were. The working class was doing that in the German Revolution. And so what they basically did was they said, okay, well, look, these workers associations we have set up, let's use those. We're not going to like disband them, but we shouldn't be throwing all of our energy into trying to build these up because we're not succeeding in doing that. So let's instead have some of our members, and that was, I think, Willich and Schapper were primarily oriented towards the workers' associations, while our other members, and which have their own publications and so on, whereas our other members will orient towards the Democratic Party as the voice of the proletarian current in the Democratic Party. And that's what Marx's newspaper, the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, was. It was an organ of the Democratic Party, but specifically of the radical left wing of the Democratic Party, which was made up primarily of these proletarian or kind of proto-proletarian elements. So they always understood the need for an independent working class party, but you can't force one into existence, right? You have to kind of work with what you have. You have to work with the class movement at its present level. Now, the lesson they learned in the course of the Revolution of 1848 is that they should not support the working class current that may be in the Democratic Party by joining the Democratic Party, because ultimately that's going to lead to a catastrophic conclusion. Again, something I'll have to discuss another time. So, and for that matter, I don't want you to conflate when I say Democratic Party. I'm not talking about like what the Democratic Party in the United States is, which is the reactionary party of the state bureaucracy and, for that matter, the private sector bureaucracy as well. What I'm talking about is a revolutionary party trying to get a democratic republic where one does not exist. And that's a very, very different thing, even though it nonetheless is still not politically the sort of thing Marxist should be, from at least from Marx's perspective, that we should be encouraging the working class to support from within, at least. But what he does think is that the working class parties, wherever there is a bourgeois revolutionary or even petty bourgeois revolutionary current moving against these reactionary vestiges, the working class movement needs to support those parties, but from an independent position. Independent organization, that is not only completely free of organizational dependency or subordination to these other parties, but it's also free of any ideological subordination. And the way you achieve that is by being clearly articulating the distinctive class interests of the proletariat and how they are related to these broader revolutionary interests of the bourgeoisie or the petty bourgeoisie, and how ultimately the proletarians need the victory of these elements against the reaction in order to fully develop their own class struggle. Now, as long as the bourgeois or petty bourgeois parties are taking a leading role in these struggles, that just means that the proletarian parties should support them from the rear and let them go to, lead the battle. They shouldn't let themselves be used as foot soldiers, right? They should force these parties to make do on their own, but support them in a way that is advantageous for their own party's strategic position. But if these parties, as commonly happens, ultimately are unable to mount a kind of sustained and serious opposition to the reactionary state, if they subordinate themselves to it, or if they just fall apart, or if they vacillate and take a kind of an inconsistent position on these questions, then the proletarian party needs to be at the forefront of that struggle and advancing the cause of bourgeois revolution not as if it is identical with their class interests, but with clarity with respect to this historical need to establish a democratic republic with civil liberties, which are fundamental to the development of the class struggle, and ultimately for the class struggle in a political mode between the proletarian parties and the parties of bourgeois class rule. So opportunism and sectarianism are in a sense connected in this context, in that the retreat from that bourgeois revolutionary struggle for like civil liberties, for example, is sectarian in that it isolates elements of the proletariat that go in for it from the broader, first of all, from the broader class movement of the bourgeois revolution, but also from the proletarian class movement, not necessarily in fact. Like the proletariat may not even have its own independent movement yet, but in any kind of an organized form. But nonetheless, there is this, so the proletariat as a class, even if as a movement, even if it's not organized as a movement, as a class has an interest in the advance of that revolutionary politics. And so isolating elements of the working class from that necessity, that historical necessity, is sectarian. But it can also be opportunistic, because what you often see, and so there's many examples of this throughout Marx and Engels' life, and this is really what they're most fundamentally concerned with criticizing within the socialist movement, not only the sectarian tendency to isolate elements of the class from that broader movement and that broader necessity, but also to do so in ostensibly the interests of the workers. So, for example, Lassalle, willing to compromise on the struggle for protection of civil liberties in the German Empire in the name of winning material support from the reactionary state for the workers, state aid, in the form of primarily in the form of loans from the government for the workers to set up their own cooperative associations. So Marx and Engels are consistently opposed to that, and that is an expression of Philistinism, which does not reflect the interests of the working class as a class, but of elements of the working class that are seeking to advance their own immediate interests, their material interests as individuals or as groups, maybe even as a nation, but at the expense of the progress of the class movement itself, which is based upon this bourgeois revolutionary struggle against the reactionary state being consummated in a political and social context in which the proletarian class struggle can fully develop. Okay, so I'm going to basically leave it there. I'll say a few things in closing here. Okay, Steve Roberts writes in the chat, the vast majority of the working class very early in adult capitalist life are faced with the life expectancy of actual survival, taking the opportunist route of personal survival in capitalist society. That's an interesting point, and like this shouldn't be understood as like stigmatizing the tendency towards opportunism in a moral or any other form like that, or sectarianism for that matter. As I said at the beginning, these are natural in the sense of like natural science, natural tendencies of the proletarian class movement, of bourgeois society in general. They're natural consequences of the development of that movement, but also of the forward movement of that struggle, as well as the regression of that struggle. And in a sense, the development always happens through a kind of complex movement between progressive and regressive tendencies and events and elements and so on. It's not a straightforward line to the end. It's a complicated spiraling dynamic that can retract, kind of contract or expand. But ultimately, the point is to maximize the extent to which the proletariat is bound up in this class movement, and the class movement is advancing from its most primitive forms to its ultimate form of the political struggle of the working class as a whole against the capitalist class as a whole for political power on a world scale. And that means, ultimately, what that really means, at least in an initial moment, the conquest of political power in the heart of global capitalism, in those political contexts that mediate the preponderance of global capital. Usually, really what we're talking about here is not the seat of industry in the sense of manufacturing, but really the seat of the global financial system and of military power that serves the preservation of the capitalist, the world market, which is what the United States' role has been since Britain gave it up, really through both World War I and World War II. So opportunism is a natural thing, and in a sense, you need to be able to use the tendency towards opportunism to your advantage if you're trying to be a Marxist, in the sense that you need to be able to draw in working people into a struggle that is advancing in this direction on the basis of their immediate interests. So it's not like there's like this set of class interests and then there's these individual interests and they're totally separate and different from each other. That can kind of turn out that way, but really they're more bound up together in a complicated dialectic. Okay, and for that matter, that dialectical movement is between, on the one hand, opportunistic pursuit of advancement and a kind of sectarian retreat from the world into an almost religious-like aspiration for something that's not really possible, at least not in the real world, like an idea, like a vision of a better society, whether that be a vision of a society that will result from some sort of catastrophic change, like an insurrection, a giant insurrection or something, or a crisis, economic crisis or whatever, or nuclear war, as like the Posadists, thought, or for that matter, just a sort of more standard utopian, ideal. These are tendencies in the broader, in play in bourgeois society more broadly as reactions to being caught in between the kind of poles of the two polar classes of society. But remember, like, everyone in society is caught between those poles, including all the proletarian workers, including all the capitalists. Nobody is like a pure abstraction. They're all bound up in the middle somewhere, but the question is, how are people grouping themselves together around this abstract dynamic, and how is that action leading that dynamic to develop into more and more, highly evolved forms, where the highest form, at least the highest form up to a certain point would be the context in which the proletariat is involved in an active struggle for political power in the advanced capitalist countries and ultimately wins that power. And then obviously there'd be further development from there. That's where the real development begins beyond capitalism. But it can only begin with the proletariat taking power over capitalism. So you need to be able to kind of recognize that these dynamics have a real have a significance, a practical, strategic significance, but they're also liabilities. They're obstacles, but the movement only advances by advancing through and beyond those obstacles. Okay, that's really all I wanted to say. Only 3 hours worth or so, but thank you for sticking it out. If you have, I'm going to be back in, I think, 3 weeks time with another stream, and you can follow me on Twitter or X at Socialist Legacy. In the meantime, if you want to, if you have any suggestions, anything you want me to talk about, any questions, feel free to post them in the comments here, or hit me up on X. And I would also be interested in the future in having other people on the stream with me to discuss things. If you're interested, let me know. But I hope this was helpful. I'm pretty happy with how it went, I think, and look forward to doing it again in the future. So thank you very much, and I will see you again soon. All right. Bye.